So guys, well, just to start things off, the idea was for us to try to have a more informal meeting, just because we covered a lot of stuff in the last couple of months. I actually, you know, I can't avoid doing stuff like drawings and stuff, so I just wrote down everything we did, right? This is pretty much what we did in the last couple of months. Right, this is just the stuff that's behind the initial idea of the project. But these things are pretty much described in that research outline that I wrote based on Dennis's work. But then this is what we actually covered thus far. Like, we had this set of meetings here that I just divided into kind of two big chunks, right? Some meetings that deal with Marx more explicitly and political theory and things like this. And some meetings, which I have here, the green arrows, which were more focused on, even if they are bringing specific content, at first they were approached more as a sort of bringing formal resources we might use in the general project, right? And you can see, and we had one general meeting for just like discussing the general strategy of everything, which I think is useful just to give a bit of meaning to this previous, like why these two theses were relevant, right? The thesis of thinking the relation between economy and political organization, and thinking about organization as collective organization as having some bearing on epistemology of politics or something like this, right? And the other side, why Badiou was relevant in all of this, and so on. So basically, we had one meeting to discuss this, which was this first meeting, which is available. And then we had, actually, you can see we had more meetings discussing, let's say, formal machinery that might be useful in this project than actually discussing Marx and politics and things like this, right? Because there are actually two meetings that went here in discussing IIT. We actually have two meetings. One already went, but there's a further one on that Yasha is presenting on category theory and topos theory. Dennis presented one also on this doctorate thesis by Ellie Adam, I think it's called, Ellie Adams, on compositionality and generative effects. And we had actually two meetings on more directly political stuff. One that we discussed very broadly, though there was some previous reading and we did go into some of the details of it, but not that much, into the transformation problem and the issues concerning representation in capitalism, which was this one. And a meeting using Karatani and Badiou to talk about social worlds, historical worlds, and so on, right? So for now, we actually have, let's say, the weights are more on the side of having brought, like, we have more of a tendency of bringing a lot of machinery without much of context to it, and less, let's say, political problems or formulations of impasses in the political field that may make those tools relevant, I think. Yeah, just wanted just to give this bit of context, because I know not everyone was here since the beginning, so it might not be clear where we are right now, right? And I think that, I'm not sure how you guys wanna go over this discussion today, but one thing that I thought we could do also is to kind of perhaps go back and revisit some of the stuff we saw in these meetings, just to start listing some of the ideas that appeared and possible developments, you know? I know that there are some projects that were already kind of suggested as further research. So I just added here some texts that I know were mentioned as possible further presentations, like Apolito's text on the problem of scale in anarchism. I know Pedro and Caron talked about Mark Wilson's Physics Avoidance, which is a book that deals a lot with a particular approach to issues concerning scale and modeling. There was also reference to two books, very different books within the Marxist tradition. One is Ulrich Krause's Money and Abstract Labor, which is an attempt to formalize Marx's work. And there is Alexander Bogdanov's Essays in Technology, which we ventured to be a kind of precursor to Badiou's approach, but even more immanent to the political side, right? And I also added here this one, Surrogate Reasoning, which is a text by John Barrowise, which was discussed more than once as an interesting text to talk about this idea of organization as means to know, right? Something that has a bearing on epistemologies. So I don't know, don't want to hijack the meeting. As you guys know, I have a tendency to do.
We wanted to add one more, I believe, me and Pedro, which is one chapter of the Ladyman and Ross book, Everything Must Go, which seems to be relevant to the discussion also that Mark Wilson gives about scales. So these would be maybe the three that we could cover in maybe 3 meetings. I was talking to Pedro a while back, a few days ago, and maybe one meeting about Apolito, which is a more political, keeping with the political theme there, and 2 meetings, one about Wilson and maybe another about Ladyman and Ross, about more, scientific approaches to scale, which probably will be will fall under the idea of formal resources here in this project, something like that.
Yeah, because I mean, I think it's all cool to add all sorts of stuff. I just think that I was talking to Raquel the other day, because we were invited to discuss kind of aspects of this project with regards to Apolito's text in a kind of a interview format with some friends. And I think that one thing that we need to be careful, just so we manage to make this into a collective research and not, let's say, a series of presentations, right? Is that I think we should try to kind of, first of all, have a clear view of the sort of underlying problematics that binds these things together, which I think is something we should use this meeting to do as well. And second, I think that this is useful so that when we come up with presentation themes and approaches, we do it in a way that it also makes the relevance of that clear for other people who are perhaps in the meeting, but not necessarily have the same background, the same set of interests and things like this, because I think the potential of what we're doing is that it's the sort of thing that allows us to bring together, as we have done already, discussions on the economy, discussions on category theory, discussions on history of social formations, discussions on militant practice and things like this. And it would be good for us, I think that a good reason to have this meeting today and is to kind of find a way to make sure from all sides we are keeping that connection alive, So, for example, it's different to have one meeting dedicated to just presenting Wilson, or a meeting to, for example, presenting topics on scale in the philosophy of science, and then you guys can bring a lot of different authors into, depends on the level of detailing you think you need to go into, And
this is something I have to discuss with Pedro, who is here, who could also speak up for his mind, but I think maybe we could do the Wilson thing with about the idea of greediness / tyranny of scales, which is a important problem in analytic philosophy of science nowadays. And there's not only Wilson, but there's also Robert Batterman that writes about it and some others. So maybe something a little bit more general could be nice as well. But we'll see. It's just because this is really something that is part of what I want to do and what Pedro wants to do. I will have to read Wilson more closely, so this would be useful to do this presentation. So.
No, I personally find it amazing. For example, I just think that imagine this following situation, right? Pedro or you are invited to talk about this project with someone. It would be good to make sure that everyone feels at home enough with the overall, with this big map, right? So that not only can you see how what you're most interested is integrated, even if only partially, into this kind of set of questions, right? But also so that when you come up with something, you're able to account for other people's interests in your presentation, right? So I think that is useful because when you have a good gauge, I don't know how you say this word, like good idea of where the other person's interests are, that also changes how you present stuff, right? If you are already obliged to, I don't know, bring into the picture something you're not very, say, it's not the direct topic of that. And I think this is going to happen a lot. Like there's nothing in the discussion of IET which is necessarily connected with the economy and so on. But because Renzo is already seeing that, he pushes the presentation towards one side. So making sure we have that common set of, ideas in place, I think makes it easier to come up with and also to, let's say, not only to come up with a good approach, but also to have a good idea of how far you need to go into something to make it useful. Otherwise, you might overinvest, like probably going through Mark Wilson stuff could be like a huge endeavor if you're singling it out. But if you're just bringing it as a sort of idea into this conversation, you might feel like you can do it quicker, or you can, do it sooner because you're not so worried of covering everything. So I think it's a good kind of standard, knowing this to help navigate, I think. But personally, I think, of course, doing the most detailed version of things is always cool. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, the reason why I just brought this up is that I think that we covered a lot of stuff. There is some sense, which I think like I know that part of the connection, for example, some connections I can make in my head as of now, like between, I know that for that particular outline of research, Apolito's text is clearly a good interlocution. And the way that she makes that interlocution brings that Tononi's research, like makes it very relevant. So you can see the connection between these things. I can kind of present them. But at the same time, I feel like I have a hard time yet seeing exactly those what Renzo presented helped me a lot. Like I still have a hard time bridging it back. Like, okay, not for explaining Apolito's text, but perhaps for, developing interesting tools to reframe some problems we were interested in. How could we do that, using what we already saw? I think that the same goes for, I mean, I'm talking about my personal understanding thus far, right? The same goes a bit for Ellie Adams' work, because I thought it was a very nice way to talk about some sorts of transformations that preserve some basic function, but lose, like it's very good for understanding transformations that lose information, right? And it seemed like part of our big issue with, okay, how would political economy look when seen from a perspective that makes it continuous with collective organization? That continuous perspective, that perspective where these things are continuous, is also a perspective where these differences in scaling are relevant. So that's a explicit variable, right? So organization seems to be a term that we use to describe things up to a certain scale. And after a certain level, it seems like things get too impersonal, too decentered, too untotalizable by cognitive means, that the discourse of decision-making, accountability, things like this don't really apply. And you start talking about things that go on by themselves, things that have kind of emergent properties, things that kind of go on behind our backs, as Marx puts it, right? And that's kind of where Marx's ideas of value, labor, social relations, fetishism, and further down the line, price, profit, come in. Things that seem to have this sort of overly structural role and not really this sort of manageable quality, right? There are concepts that are meant to explain how people organize when they are just kind of navigating a system and not really putting the system into motion, something like this, right? And from what I understood of Dennis's presentation, it seemed to me like that idea of generative effects, not so much as a sort of effect of complexity, but a function of what he calls veiling, right? You can turn some structure into a simpler structure where a lot of information is lost through different function. And that different function actually accounts for what we usually call emergent properties, this sort of stable structures that are not really, you can't really embed them back into the dynamics that created them and exhaust them in that way. It seemed like that was a machinery that helped think this sort of thing that seems relevant for example, discussions like, how does this big, large-scale dynamic appear for people who deal with it on the go, like as what Hayek calls it, right? So I remember in that meeting we discussed this. It seemed to me very relevant, though we didn't really continue down that line in detail, right?
Yeah. On that topic, I was thinking we could actually connect Ellie Adams's thesis with Badiou pretty naturally by suggesting that the veil is something like the count as one, and that the lost information is kind of the very similar to the inexistent in Badiou. So in every like phenomenal object has this part of it that is inexistent. It's not counted in the world, but it can have effects. It just, you cannot trace those effects back to the inexistent, and that's something that Badiou doesn't exactly talk about. But I mean, he kind of does, of course, but it's like not explicit that if we think of all parts of a object as in a causal sense, like each thing can cause something to happen in the object, then the inexistent would be an effect without a cause, right? They would be effects where you can't exactly pinpoint where it came from. So maybe, again, it's not like emergent it's not emergent necessarily, but it's there is a materialist kind of reading that there can be effects whose cause have been like occluded by the count as one of a particular,
Yeah, just to clarify what we're talking about, this is the text. It's called Generativity and where is the title? Systems, Generativity and Interactional Effects. and this guy tries to account for a bunch of different phenomena using this compositional method that kind of separates, and I personally, I thought that was one of the big things, that he separates the discussion of this interactional effect from the discussion of complexity. You can have the appearance of these things both in complex and more simple systems, right? And this is the basic formula for when interactional effects emerge, right? He calls this function here a veil, right? So you have a set and some operation on it, right? I think this is actually a partial order structure, isn't it?
Yeah,
yeah,
both
binary
key and S.
Yeah, and this is a different one, a different set with a different operation on it. And this function just maps one onto the other. And he defines interaction effects as when the function on the operated terms of the first system is not the same as mapping one term and then making the operation inside the new system with the other mapped term, right? So the veiling of this operation is not the same as the veiling of a term and the operation on the veiling of the second term.
It's not a natural transformation.
It's not a functor.
It's not a functor.
It fails to be a functor. And the very novel thing also here is that we can actually characterize the lost information. So it's not completely lost, right? We can test this veil and discover what was lost, like reverse engineer it, basically.
Yeah, so it's how does that go again? If you like, right, this is the veiling of this plus this is different from the veiling of this plus the veiling of that, but you can make this equalize, right, by adding a third term here, right?
Yeah.
So if you add some other term, which is calculatable, right?
Yeah.
You can make this again into an equality.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's actually the theory of the effect itself, of the generative effect. That's that third term, right? Basically, if you take all the behaviors that you expect and you subtract away all the behaviors that you can explain, sorry, if you take all the behaviors as such, which is the left of the equal, and you subtract away the behaviors you can explain, you are left with behaviors you cannot explain, right? Given the...
This looks like you mentioned, Badiou, this looks like the generic extension.
Yeah, I think there's a connection, yeah, with, you have to adjoin something to the system in order to, a supplement, yeah, to explain these effects. And that's what the third term is. And he uses, the theory of spaces, of cohomology in particular, to characterize this term. So I think it's very relevant to us, especially when we are talking about now, taking smaller systems and then adding them together, like scaling them up, right? There might be, as we add systems together, we might produce these effects that we cannot trace back to the the subsystems.
Yeah, it's very similar to the thermodynamic systems too.
I mean, it's also very similar to, you can also interpret in terms of integrated information. I think, like, you can take the first term, it's the full model, and in the right is what happens if you try to account for the system in terms of its parts, and the C, like the difference is like this something you cannot account by using this function on its parts. So it's like a synergistic term. So it's what you lose if you try to understand a system in terms of its parts, or in a lower scale maybe.
And do you think this second equation could be used to understand or to define the price of production in Marx too?
Yeah, this I think is something we started talking about the first time, right? So I mean, this thing here seems to have a relation here, right? But I also think that again, how was the price of production is the production costs, right?
Yeah.
Plus
Plus
the average profit.
Yeah. And the price of the constant capital and the variable capital is very similar to this. I don't know how do you call this veil?
Yeah, this thing here, he called it a veil.
A veil, yeah.
Yeah, it's veiling
Yeah.
because it takes, like, there was more information here than there is here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you lose something, and then the good part of this is that depending on how you think through this effect, like formalizing it in this way allows you to do the second thing, right? You can now reconstruct it, like calculate what was lost rather than just assume.
Isn't it the opposite though? Or no?
Yeah, I think you start from this definition of veiling as this function is defined in this way, right? And then he shows that if you analyze this using this, how's it called, cohomology stuff, right? That you can actually come up with an equivalent construction where this is actually balanced out, right? So you can, I think this is important because that you can come up with this last term, that you can come up with a term that balances it out, doesn't mean that this is what was hidden, right? This is like, doesn't mean that it has a reality that was hidden in the previous thing, right?
Yeah, that's the important part too.
Right?
Yeah, because
it doesn't mean that you would find C if you open this black box, right?
yeah, exactly.
So the analogy with the price is not so good, maybe.
No, perhaps it's good because I mean, it does seem like average profit is kind of like this thing that is meant to balance out the equation, right? Mm-hmm. Like the way that I would think about it was almost to say like the first one accounts for surplus value, right? It actually accounts for it very nicely because the value of constant capital plus variable capital is different than the value of constant capital plus the value of variable capital.
Yes.
Right. That's even the definition of surplus, right? Let me write this better. I mean, I'm not sure if this is clear for everyone, but in Marx, right, the whole point is that if you go to the market, so if you go to the market and check the value of means of production, right, constant capital as he calls it, constant because the best it can do is just transfer its own value to commodities. So if the machinery costs 100 and it produces 100 things, each thing will absorb 1/100th of the value, right? So 1. And the value of variable capital, which is human labor, right? If you see the value of these two things in the market separately, the sum of them it's just the sum of them is just the sum of the parts, right? But in the production process, when you actually bind together constant capital with variable capital, they actually produce more than they're worth, right? So the value
with the caveat that the plus sign on the left is different from the plus sign on the right. They don't have to be the same kind of.
Yeah, actually, I should this thing here should, this should be actually this is already in his, right? He distinguishes this he distinguishes this and this, right? And so here here this is actually, distinguished as well. So this is like this,
Mm-hmm.
and here is a plus, right? So this is valid for here. So if plus on this side here means, let's say, additive in the sense of the combined price of two commodities, like addition, right? Inside here, this is actually a productive addition, right? In the sense of combination of the two. Like this is compositional. Yeah. You could even say to be the Badiou nerd that this is compositional in the sense of objects, and this is relational in the sense of, right? It needs to preserve what's inside, and this actually changes what's inside. So in any way, like this first formula seems to be a bit like this first one here. And then I think what you said, Raquel, is that perhaps we could imagine average profit precisely as the thing that is supposed to make this constant capital combined with variable capital equal, right, to the value of things taken separately, right?
Yes.
So it's like, okay, plus an average profit here.
And this average profit doesn't come directly from the variable capital. So it's good to write about it like that, because you don't see it coming directly from the variable capital that is being invested in this case, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you were to look inside, so I'm not even sure how I would write these two sets, right? So like in the case of the veiling function, there is some set here with this operation and the veiling here, right, which we were calling V, to this other set here. Whatever it is that we want to call this, right? If you were to look inside of it, you wouldn't find this, right? It's not like you can just look at variable capital and its relations, like the relations between labor force. You wouldn't find surplus in it anyway.
Yes. And I just bring this subject of prices because I think for me, reading Apolito's text was very important because I start to think about the four forms that Marx defined prices in capital as exchange value, as how do you say that? Cost price and production price and market price. They are all different scales of is Marx defining price in different scales, you know. And I when you draw this equation, I thought it could be helpful to think this problem in this way. I don't know.
Can you say a bit more on how you see the scale differences playing? I remember you said this to me a while back, and it wasn't so clear to me, but it seems very interesting, but also not obvious, you know?
Because I think, I don't know if I can explain it in English, and my English is very awful, so I'll try. But if you remember in chapter 1 from Capital, Marx gives, how can I say that? Oh my God, how do you say roteiro? Script, sorry. Yeah, Marx gives a kind of script of how he would do something that is different from political economy, and he will give a concept. He will define capital from the concept of value. And I think what is the big problem for the big problem that Marx sees in the political economy is that they have a concept of value, but they cannot understand how emerges super value from that, and and cannot pass from a concept of value to a concept of capital. So Marx gives a script with 3 steps in this first chapter. And the steps are, you begin with exchange value, you begin with the more immediate thing that you find in the market. And then you will, from the exchange value, you define value as an abstraction. How can I say that? Value is kind of an abstraction that you define from exchange value, you know, because two different things can only be exchangeable with each other if they have common substance, if there are expressions of common substance. So this common substance is value, and this is how Marx defines it. And the third step is the most important step, because it's the step that the political economy doesn't take, is to come back from value to exchange value and think exchange value as a form of manifestation of value.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying these 3 steps because this, if you think about the structure of this script, you will see this structure all along capital. Every time that...
Sorry, can we go through each step again, just so I can write it down here?
You begin with exchange value, then you define value as the substance. You can only have two things being exchangeable in the market if they are expression of a single substance. So you define value like an abstraction from exchange value. And the third step is to go back to exchange value as a manifestation, as a form of manifestation, form of manifestation of value.
Mm-hmm.
In these 3 steps, you find all along capital every time Marx wants to define again price. This is the first one. This is in the commodity chapter is the first time that Marx defines price. So it's the first time he presents this script, but it appears all along capital when he wants to do it again.
Yeah.
But when he tries to define production price, then the elements that he uses is completely different. But the structure of the script is the same. You know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we can make it.
No, it makes sense to me. Like I just wanted to write this down because I totally agree with you that he begins with this equation, right? And then he asks, how can it be that x of y is exchangeable by y of b? And he says, well, only if there is some abstract proportion that allows these things to be compared, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, yeah, but in effect, this equality is actually asymmetric, right? Because in this equation, this part here actually, like this equation acquires almost like a predicative structure, right? It's actually saying the value of x of a is y of b, right? So this here doesn't express its own value. It only expresses its value in the body of this one, right?
Yeah.
So this embodies value, right?
Yeah. But you can think also that this third step is something like when you think about the complete circuit of capital, every exchange value that appears in this circuit is a form of manifestation of the movement of capital. And I think this is the third step, you know. Marx is kind of presenting what is capitalist domination. Capitalist domination is every form that value appears is a form of the movement of value or the movement of capital. I think it's more than just this development of the form of value, you know? Is Marx trying to present the capitalist domination? And if you want, we can think very quickly here about what happens when Marx defines price of production. That was the text that we almost discussed and that other encounter. Marx begins then with the profit rate. It's the immediate thing that appears to capitalists. Then the second step is to think, where does it come from? It comes from, how do you say?
I can help you with the translation, don't worry.
A taxa de mais-valia é surplus rate mesmo?
Surplus rate, yeah.
Surplus rate, yeah. So he begins with the profit rate, and then he asks where it comes from. It comes from surplus rate. It comes from the not the exploitation that one capital makes individually, but all capitals, all singular capital in society makes in all together, you know. And then this mass of surplus that is produced by all capital is divided. This is the third step. Is divided in the form of the profit rate that is the medium, the average, yeah. The average profit rate. So it's I don't know if you agree with me, but it's the same structure. It's the same script. He just works with different elements.
Yeah, it's true, because you have some profit rate 1 and a profit rate 2, yeah. Right? And then you go to a third thing, which is here, which is the total surplus extracted.
Yeah, and it's always something abstract, you know.
Yeah.
Value is abstract, so this total surplus is totally abstract too, you know. So
yeah, and then but then it's not. I don't think it fits this because it's more complicated. But the averaging that goes here actually is determined by this thing, right? So the third term actually falls into this thing.
But I just brought this up because I think it's a difference of scale when you pass from value or exchange value to prices of production. You are modifying something on scale only. The structure, the script, I think it's almost the same, but you are working in the second case with global competition, for example. You have to have global competition to understand it.
Yeah.
The first case is more, it's different. I think it's more something like local, I don't know.
Yeah, but it's funny because at the same time, just put the two here. It seems to me like what you're saying is interesting in two levels, because within this movement, there is, let's say, something that is observable here, like a local property. You can exchange X of A for Y of B. Then he needs to there is already a mention to something which is like the very argument. I remember this from the first chapters of Capital, is an argument about, yeah, but look that this proportion remains invariant throughout a series of exchanges, right? Like the movement between 1 and 2 is like saying, yeah, but this series is actually infinite. Like it's X of A equal Y of B equals Z of C, and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So you get the feeling that there is some index behind them. So it is kind of already like a outer view or more external view or a slightly different scale, perhaps you could call it, right?
Yeah.
So this is not a local state. This statement is not a local, like it's not the proportion between these two things. It's the proportion between any two things, right?
Yeah.
So inferior to this, there is already a sort of local to global and then back to local, knowing that this global information is written into the local, right?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah. I was just going to say here, between 2 and 3, I feel like that's where we can locate this Hayekian thing about the man on the go sees prices, or perhaps from 1 to 3, the man on the go sees prices and then makes some decision based on what would, yield the most profit, let's say.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, the relationship to competition, we can kind of already see it on the left side, although it's not a totality yet, right, of competition. But the whole point is like you wouldn't exchange unless there was some kind of motivation, like accumulation, right? That's the.
Now that you say it, I think it's a good way of talking about the difference between Marx and Hayek with regards to this third term, because Marx is clearly interested in the beginning of Capital on this point, right? Like he distinguishes relative and equivalent form, the fact that, for example, that the universal equivalent form puts any commodity, right, equal to some amount of money. And he says, well, this is a commodity that is in this particular place. You can understand this place by looking at the invariant abstract thing that is behind it, right? He's interested more, let's say, in this structural invariance at this point than Hayek, because Hayek is interested in the fact that whatever comes to occupy this place, right, which is price, it does have more information than a local. Like this localization here is actually different than this one, right? So there is added information in this. So it's like a phenomenological thing, right? In the normal sense, like if you look at this, you see more than just a commodity. Like when you look at the amount of money that rice costs, you're not only looking at the amount of money that rice costs, you have a bit of a glimpse of something of some connection between things. Whereas Marx is not so much interested at the beginning of Capital on the fact that you see more than, that you actually get information by looking at money. And he's trying actually to understand why is it that money can have that information, right? Which is because of value. Like it's slightly different questions. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but right? Couldn't you distinguish perhaps Hayek and Marx in this way, right? One looks at money and says, see, it is possible for something locally to carry information about the system of exchange, which is price. And Marx is saying, what are the conditions necessary for price to be able to carry some information? Well, the only way is if there is something called value, and it actually appears in the form of a commodity, right? It appears in the form of exchange value.
Yeah, no, I agree that, yeah, value kind of disappears in Hayek's thing because, well, we can make a connection because if you were to say in between the relative and the equivalent form, you have the, not in between, but at some point, Marx has the universal equivalent, right? So the difference between equivalent and universal equivalent is that the universal equivalent can actually, you can make a chain of commodities that like y of b is equal to x0a, which is equal to x1 of a1, which is equal to x2 of a2, and so on, right? It makes an infinite enchainment of, and I think that's the information in price, because if in isolation, if you were on an island and you only had two commodities, then the information would be very poor for price, because the price would only cover two commodities. Let's say, okay, one commodity and money. Then
I don't think you can have price with only two commodities. Like if there only existed two commodities, you would just have barter.
Right. Yeah. So you need there's some scale threshold at
I
at
didn't
some
want to
point.
say.
Then price becomes the like you see more because price captures that entire series of equivalences, right?
Yeah, I mean, doesn't it look like this is like this?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's universally exposed.
The universal
Exposes the
equivalent
relation.
is literally a universal relation.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, exactly. And these other cones here are just the other equivalents, like, you know, because there's this, you can come up with an infinite series of equivalents, but it just happens to be that money is the best of all of those cones. So it's the universal cone. Yeah, it's the closest to seeing all of the commodities. Yeah, it's perfect.
I really think this. I really think this would work, like step by step. You know.
Yeah.
Again, just for not everyone is up to this, but this is Badiou's definition of what he calls universally exposed relation. Which we realized is actually not written exactly. I mean, he makes a bit of a weird mix of formalisms to come up with his definition of this exponent, right? But
you see, do you think that what defines prices is the second step in every script always? I don't know. I think this is the I don't know, the threshold that Denis was talking about.
Yeah, there's the threshold where price becomes this kind of lens into or view into the world of commodities. So you look at price and now you understand all of the commodities. It's like an oracle.
Yeah, but also, I mean, wouldn't you distinguish between, for example, for Marx, it's like this, right? It's the relation between this and this, whereas for Hayek, is the relation between this, right? X of A equals, for example, some amount of money, and X of A equals some other amount of money. Like for him, this carries information, right? Fluctuations of price are like this, right? This is not what is interesting to Marx. Marx doesn't study this directly. Like the idea that, I mean, he does mention, but the idea that fluctuations in price of a same quantity, this difference here is actually, right, information rich.
Yeah. I mean, in Hayek's text, at least from what I've read, it does seem like he cares a lot about transient information. So like in time, looking for short-term opportunities, right? Like if I see if I see a good deal, let's say, a good deal by definition, it's like transitory. It's not going to always be that way, right? So I need to jump on that good deal. Yeah. And it's by acting on these good deals that we produce these like universal coordination.
Yeah, I'm just trying to kind of grasp better where Marx and Hayek diverge in their focus, right? Because it seems to me that Marx here, as Raquel was saying, he's interested in the fact that in this equation, or to put it already in, let's say, in the full form, right? That this term has a different function than this term. So it's this difference that he's interested in, right? As Raquel was saying, that because this second term here is actually the appearance of this middle term, right? Whereas Hayek seems to be interested in the fact that this equation is different from this equation. So he never tries to go behind the veil, right? Or behind the curtain or whatever. He just wants to show that this fluctuation, right? At T1, it's like this. At T2 is like this. That this fluctuation actually means something, right?
Does it make sense to say that so in Hayek prices more or less that signal that arrive is like a non-local signal. We have like a on the spot which has access to like a really high dimensional information of but local spatial temporal information. But the only thing that can arrive which is non-local is price, which is a kind of like veil that makes you lose information. So you lost the concrete stuff, but it arrives to you because it's price, so it's like a veiled form. And he's interested in from this guy, this man on the spot guy. He's looking at these different price signals already, which already cover, like already lost the traces of what produced them. And Marx is interested in kind of like retracing the local production of that signal in a sense. Like, so in sense, so Hayek compares these non-local signals, which is these two prices, and while Marx tries to retrace them to their local production. I don't know.
Yeah, I would put it in something like that, because you can do the same division with the average profit rate that Raquel was talking about. Like, you can, by looking at the fact that there is some average profit rates, right? You can either go back and analyze the fact that the genesis of this, or its structural condition, is the total surplus produced by society, which is then redistributed, right? Or you can do what is usually the capitalist analysis, which is to say different profit margins kind of tell a capitalist where to go. Like, if an industry is more profitable now, that's where you should invest, right? But like, this is a different regulator than this, right? Here is a differential. Difference is the regulator. The difference between prices at different moments in time tells you what's interesting and what's not interesting, where you should invest, where you shouldn't, what's in more demand, what is in less demand, right? And that's valid both for price and for profit rates. Like,
yeah, that's very interesting. That's exactly the same thing. The difference of profit rates is the same thing as Hayek is saying of the difference of prices. The first column, the same thing.
Exactly. So, but like, so in both cases, you have like Hayek focusing on this sort of difference between prices or between profit rates, and saying, well, this difference is meaningful because it tells you where to go, right? It tells you what to do next. Whereas for Marx, the very equation, the very existence of profit rates is saying something about the structure that already happened in a way, right? If there is average profit rates, then there is a mechanism for distributing total surplus amongst capitalists.
Yes.
So like one thing doesn't exclude the other, right?
Isn't this also kind of like two ways to interpret the generative effect formula? Like, you could on one hand say that the term, like the synergy term, comes from the mechanism inside that's the space that gave origin. On one hand, trying to trace it back to the original system, and in the other case, you're saying no, actually, once you veil, this term appears not from the original system that produced it, the mechanism, but it's just like, I don't know, it's something else, something more like, I don't know how to put it, but it would explain it in terms of this on the second space, on the space of the right, which is kind of the interpretation from Adam, right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So it's like saying,
you could say on one case that the C term lives in the space of the phi function, and on the second case you say, well, but it can be traced by a real interaction inside the original space that before you apply the phi.
Yeah, so Marx, it's almost like Marx would take this inequality and say, okay, so let's investigate this, and Hayek would take this inequality and take it as purely coming from here, right?
Yeah, I think we could. The way I read it is that it's the C can either be a standalone thing, having no prior cause to it, or it's was lost in the veil because the veil is an imperfect reflection of something. So it's actually like the Hegel thing. It's a kind of Hegelian thing. Is the veil hiding something behind it, or is the veil essence itself? Something like that. So
yeah, when we talked about Adam, I think that was clear, right? The problem of, okay, is he saying that this inequality is actually a surface effect of a deeper equality? You just didn't account for something, right? It was lost. Like the magician example, right? The magician makes, this is how he talks about it. Like this is his first example. Like this is a set of gestures a magician makes, right? So he binds a bunch of states together like this, like, and so on. And through the veiling, so through showing and not showing you everything he did, you get a different thing that looks like he did this, then he did this, right? And you say, oh my God, there is some effect that appeared that I don't see where it came from. So that's magic, right? And the question is, okay, if you were like, is this added effect reducible back to the set of stuff that the guy did? Or is it, let's say, the set of stuff that the guy did plus the fact that he hid something, right? Is the hiding productive or just subtractive, right? Something like this, perhaps.
yeah, and actually IIT is really nice here, because in IIT, when you isolate the subsystems using that method of iterating and choosing, like I forget the name for it, where you take like where you group certain channels, right, and count them as one, as if they're, and do that marginalization process, you do find extra information, right? Because you start out with that transition probability table, and it's like everything at the smallest level, and then you start to group them together, and when you group them, you find that you get a surprise, right? Some extra information from what you expected appears. So I think that's a nice way to think about this.
Yeah, I think it appears on one is in this one you're mentioning, which is more like causal emergence, more related to like the whole things, right? Once you map your coarse grain TPM, you end up finding like a channel of more information. And the other way it also appears in the formalism is when you try to cut something and when you test the irreducibility of something, if a mechanism is irreducible, you find out that it is really a higher order mechanism. Like it's higher, this compositionality, it's real, like it's attributable to the mechanism itself and not
yes.
to...
I think the coarse graining is like the veil, and then the compositional step, the cutting thing, that's like learning about the space of C, the third term.
Yeah.
You mean that that partitioning thing, right?
Yeah, the partitioning, that's the coarse graining, right?
Is it like when you have like a system and you try to see what is the most, like the largest part,
the cut that makes the least of a difference, right?
Yeah, the part that makes the least of a difference, right?
Then that's the cutting part, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think the cutting part corresponds to learning about the third term C, the generative effect.
Yeah, because you want to see what is the added information that looking at the parts doesn't give you, right?
Yeah, exactly. You want to characterize the extra information, but before that, you already got the extra information through comparing the, like, I remember it was like you basically have the completely entropic situation, right? Like what you expect given an entropic, like if everything was just random, right? And then you get an effect that has some whatever KL divergence from that random state, and that's the veiling part, I think.
But I think the way I agree that the tool IT gives you to like learn about the C is through partitioning and seeing what you lose. And but I think both you have both coarse graining, which is something, and higher order mechanisms, which are two ways in which you can gain this. Because like coarse graining is really similar to veiling, but higher order mechanisms is not a form of veiling; it's a form of like real interaction, like production of I think thinner, like this surplus term of is a different way to produce the C. The coarse graining, you reduce your state, the size of your repertoire in order to gain something else, which is like effective information. And in the higher order mechanism, which is like reducibility or integration, it's actual like production by irreducible constraints, by higher order. So it's
like it's called concepts, right? At one point.
Concepts or causal distinctions. Or
yeah, but I see what you mean. Like actually, there are two mechanisms here, right? Because I think the veiling perhaps is too loosely defined, because that idea that there is some operation on two terms that is different from the operation on one plus the operation on the other, it leaves something. It leaves two options, right? That this function here is like, to use a parlance that we also used before as well, like you chose a certain level of abstraction, or you start to cover a space with a certain resolution, which is the coarse graining thing, which reduces the state space but gains information, right? So that's the whole Hoek thing about coarse graining. Right, for people who didn't read this, the Hoek, he shows you can have like one of these things that Renzo showed, like a transition probability matrix, which has, for example, a bunch of values, like so you look at T1 and T2 and its transformation, right? And you have like a bunch of, I don't know, small probabilities, and the amount of information you have for it is actually low. And if you reduce it and make it a smaller state space, right? And you kind of, for example, bring all of this into like a thing like this, like smaller version of it, which kind of averages some of the values. You actually can have more information here than you had here, right? This is a kind of veiling in that sense. It reduces the amount of states, right? But it actually gets a better view of the state space than the fine-grained one. So that's in the text, the map, and the territory. It gives you a formal approach to showing how this sort of coarse covering of the space actually can increase information. But that's, I agree with you, it's important to distinguish that from what you actually showed in the presentation, which is not that, right? Which I think a good way of talking about this other version is almost like the power set structure. Like the power set of X and Y, so the amount of possible states of their combined is actually larger than the power set of this state plus the power set of this state, right? So you actually get more. It's not simply you're abstracting away information, but there are certain functions that, considering the number of parts, so the number of parts of this is only like, you would only get X and 0, Y and 0. So you get 3 parts, right? 0 is repeated, X and Y. Whereas if you do the power set of X and Y, you have more. You have one, you added 1, right? You have X and Y, X, Y and 0. So there is an added part that is not included in the power set of X and the power set of Y. This is not veiling in that sense. This is not the product of abstraction. This is actually the product of an expanded compositional space.
Yeah.
Right? Does that make sense, guys? Like, I'm not sure if it makes sense. So this is
so you're saying the power set of X plus the power set of Y is not equal to the power set of X union with Y.
right?
Yeah, right. I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So the
Yeah,
power
that is
set.
correct. This
Yeah,
is correct. This
yeah,
is correct, but this is different than your previous explanation, because in this case, if you map this to the lattice information, this lattice has more elements, is made of more nodes than the other
yes,
lattice.
yes, exactly. And I think that this, like, you have both examples in IET. You have the coarse graining example, which actually diminishes the size of the lattice and increases the information. But you also have what he called higher order structures, which is when the state space includes parts that are not singletons, are not immediate elements, right? Or the state space of the system is larger than the parts of the system, which is the higher order version, right? So there are two. If this is a good example, I'm not sure if this is perfect, though there is an important role that the power set of causal mechanisms play in IET, right? I think that these are two ways of C appearing, which is what Renzo was mentioning. Like in this case here, you actually get higher order.
It's related to the postulate of composition. Like normally like in reductionist approaches, you have like the parts like X and Y, and you would say, well, you don't have nothing else that can exist. And the postulate of composition is precisely, you actually have to consider the whole power set and then test for each of the elements in the power set whether they exist irreducibly. And the way you test for that is through the cutting.
So for example, I think that this actually has a good correspondence in Marx, because this is how cooperation works. For example, cooperation, in the chapter on cooperation, Marx makes the clear statement, quite obvious in fact, right, that the labor of X plus Y is actually distinct than the labor of X plus the labor of Y. Like this guy works 10 hours and produces 100. This guy works 10 hours and produces 100. But the cooperative, the composition of their labors doesn't produce 200. It produces much more than 200. So this guy can lift 10 kilos. These guys can lift 10 kilos. But when they lift something together, they can lift more than 10 or 20. They can lift more. So you get a certain added thing coming from cooperation, which is not a veiling, right? It's different from the coarse graining thing, which is this sort of
It's Hayekian, right? It's kind of an eulogy of what you can get once you lose, when the market loses and transforms things into price, I think.
Can you say that again? I think I missed it a bit.
Yeah, the coarse graining is like, it convinces you that like what the market does, which is like losing the richness of the local information of the man on the spot. Once you cover all that stuff and transform that into like just a signal, you can gain stuff, which is what the markets can do, right? You can produce this kind of knowledge that appears in this different scale by veiling like the detailed information. While in the second case, it's more about like cooperation and the way that local reactions can produce stuff.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting.
Yeah, because Hayek doesn't have a theory for what is really causing prices to move. Well, I think Marx does. Like, because I think for Marx, he locates this dynamic, the plus sign on the left side, right, is this like dynamic conjoining of material forces that you know, basically locates it in labor, right? Locates labor as a source of
yeah, I mean, and you can actually see this because this is exactly the formula for how surplus is produced, relative surplus is produced through cooperation, right? This is, you add this term here, this is the amount of stuff you can, this is the amount of extra value you can extract from laborers who work together that doesn't really belong to any of the terms, right? If you put two people to work together, they will produce more than if they work separately. And the fact is that this added work, which would balance this out, it cannot be assigned back to them. It's not true. Like you cannot locate who was the guy or how should this be returned back to them, right? There's no way, because it's actually a function of the compositionality. It's not a functioning of the laborers themselves. So there is no tracing it back, right?
Yeah, it's nice that you chose C, because that's why the capitalist steps in and says,
yes,
this is we can't locate it in any of these parts, so I guess I should locate it in my own ingenuity, right?
Yeah, so I think that, and this goes back, I think this is something that has been interesting me a lot, because what Raquel said about this movement here, I think we could apply it, so sorry, where is this? Here, this movement here, you could apply it to inside the production process itself, because in the chapters, like between chapters 9 and 13, which are the chapters that dedicated to machinery in Capital, you have a very weird process where Marx describes cooperation as the easiest form of extracting relative surplus, right? Meaning surplus that doesn't come from extending the amount of hours that people work. So workers remain, they work the same amount of hours, right? But you can extract more surplus from them. Then he says, well, the moment that this is possible and you get a sort of added surplus labor, right? In this way, you have a new form of organization of workers, which no longer sees them as unified workers doing kind of complete activities. But since there's already a mismatch between value or commodities, products, and the activity, right? The amount of products cannot be traced back to the sum of their activities. Is the composition of their activities, which actually comes up with that surplus. You get what he calls manufacture structure. Manufacture. And in manufacture, workers become what he calls partial workers. So people are not combining their labor as if like, I do something like I build a watch, and then I give you the watch engine functioning, and you do the nice kind of covering with the glass of the watch, and then somebody else does something else. Like every activity that was at first treated as one activity becomes divided into parts that have no meaning in themselves, right? So I only put one part of the engine of the watch, somebody else does just one other part of the engine, and somebody else does another part. And like this whole thing is kind of reduced or decomposed, right, into a bunch of small activities, which no longer has the face of what we used to call work, right? Like this partial labors, as he calls them, they're not, none of them we would recognize as labor. So this is when activities such as a boy that takes all the paper that falls from one machine or from one person's labor, he just pulls it to the other guy's workspace, and that's his labor. Like that's not a complete activity. Like that's not a labor in any meaningful sense, like of changing something to something else. It's a part of an activity, right? You can decompose it beyond what's meaningful for us, right? And then he says, once you can do this, which is already a machine-like process of decomposing wholes into parts, and that almost stretches the limits of what's bodily possible for a human laborer, then you get industry. Because you already had a machine-like structure here. So you can actually just find the proper expression of this manufacturer relation in machines. Machines can do this, like they're literally built of parts that make up a whole, right? So there is a similar structure of, there is something excessive being produced, but with no place. Then there is a sort of mediative role of composing and decomposing work, right? It can be composed into many parts, and these many parts can compose a larger part, and you get like a sort of social relation that looks like machinery, and then machinery becomes the appearance of that social relation, right? So when then you have the worker here and machinery here, like machinery embodies this, and the worker now becomes a sort of appendix to it, right? So it's pretty much the same idea of something that appears as a social relation in abstract, right? This principle of decomposition of bodies into small gestures gets objectified into a thing. So it also, yeah?
No, I just wanted to, if you can go back to the inequation that you talked about earlier and mentioned cooperation for the first time. It's the other side of the, the page.
This crazy, yeah.
Yeah, no, because after this explanation that you gave, I was thinking about something. Because when cooperation emerges, I think, no, don't erase.
No, I'm gonna just write it in a way that people can actually read it, right?
Okay. Because I think when cooperation emerges, X and Y are redefined. They are not the same in one side of the equation and in the other, because the social force that cooperation creates imposes to the worker what you was explaining. The worker is just a partial worker, and he has to work in an average time that is imposed by this mechanism. That is the collective worker. I don't know if this is the translation.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just thinking about this inequation. Does it make sense to say that X and Y are different in one side of the inequation from the other? Because when cooperation emerges, you don't have anymore this kind of worker that you have in the right side, that a worker that knows everything from the process of work and controls everything. The worker that emerges in the other side is a worker that, as you said, just knows a partial thing about the process.
Yeah,
and I think this is just one more thing is that I think this is a question in Apolito's text, because she, how can I say that? She bets, if I can say that, in cooperation, and I agree with her. I think it's right. But the problem is that cooperation creates this alienation, if we can say it like that, because the social force that emerges from cooperation imposes something to these workers, and I think we have to think about how minimize, I don't know, the alienation that emerges in this process. I don't know.
But like that's why I suggested we should divide, like we should read these three parts. I find them absolutely underappreciated, like the chapter on cooperation, manufacture, in a large industry.
I love them too.
I find them absolutely amazing, and I like also because Marx, when he talks about cooperation, he says like this is the easiest way to do the thing that we actually wrote about first, right? Because when you actually bring together, when you bring together constant capital and variable capital, right? there are many ways of doing this. For example, just imagine the first sense, which is I buy machines, but I buy like 10 sewing machines, like máquinas de costura. And then I buy the labor power of 10 people to sew, but each one is in a different place. So besides the sewing machines, I need to pay rent for 10 different places, right? Cooperation is the first way to make these two terms interact, because a large amount of variable capital uses the same rent space. So the proportion between constant and variable can change. The composition of constant and variable is more interesting in this way, right? So he says cooperation is at first is stimulated by capital, not only because the combination of labors creates a surplus, right? But also because it diminishes the cost of constant capital. Like if everyone is working under the same roof, I only need to pay for one roof, which is less, even if it's a larger space, it's still less than I would have to pay for each one to work separately in different small workshops, right? But then he says that if on the one hand, the positive sides for the capitalist are the extraction of this surplus labor and the lowering of constant capital, there is a problem, which is organization of laborers. Like this becomes too obvious that the laborers, like it's almost like you make too apparent that there is such a thing as the organization of workers, right? And he says that you should understand, let's say, the discipline of the manufacturing space also as an attempt to cut this down, right? So the spontaneous organization of workers is substituted for the disciplinary structure of manufacturing spaces. Like, so at the level of cooperation, there would be a contradiction, right, between the surplus being produced and also the diminishing at the level of alienation. Like it becomes almost too obvious, the connection between the surplus and the work, right? So the reabsorption of the problem of organization by a managerial figure that does a sort of science of cooperation, right? Is also a way of making that alienating you from that surplus, right? From the connection between that surplus and its origin. So this is also what would lead us to the manufacture. So I think that he deals with what you just said in the passage between the two, you know?
Yes.
Because of the tension between these two things. But overall, I think it has a very similar structure to what you were talking about with this basic move, right? Of which now that I think of, it has a bit of a, like if you take this to be a more external operation, right? And this to be a more internal one, like this is compositional, right? It mixes the two terms together in a way that this relation doesn't. Or this one preserves a certain space between things and this one actually doesn't, right? It looks a bit like the difference between composition and relation in the weak sense, right? This relates things but doesn't change them, whereas this one actually changes what it relates, right? I'm just saying this because in the example that we gave, where this at first seems like a relation, and then Marx says, yeah, but how is it that these two things can relate? They can only relate for real if there is a third term, right? Value here. And then we saw that he says, well, but this third term is not outside of the world. It has an objective existence, meaning that it's actually like this. So this is the idea I propose. Like, so you actually get money as a cone, like a limit for this thing here, right? One way of thinking about this is kind of like turning compositions into relations, I think. Like every time you get this inequality, right? This is actually an inequality here. Every time you get an inequality, or whatever, you turn it into an explicit term, right? To make it equatable again. So you turn a compositional effect into the relation between more things. I'm not sure if that makes the amount of sense I would like it to make, but that idea, I think.
But what do you think would be the term in this inequation that we wrote just now? It would be the social force that cooperation creates, or the social force that emerges from composition?
Yeah, I think so. Like in this above term here, that's what we're suggesting, right? That
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back to this difference here, right? To this idea that that if you have the set X union, right, of X and set Y, you have less than if you get the power set of X and Y, right? This thing here has more inside of it.
Yeah, but the only thing that I was thinking is that when you add this third element, this social force that emerges from composition, I think you are changing the kind of worker that you have. I don't know if it is it's a contradiction or in this equation. I think no, but you are changing the kind of worker. The kind of worker that is in the right side from this equation is a worker that has control of all the process of work. And the worker that is in the other side, in the left side, is a worker that doesn't have anymore the control of all the process. And
but wouldn't this be accounted for the difference between the operations, perhaps, you know? I mean, if you change the relation, you also change the worker, like the worker is not a substance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. I'm just thinking that there might be something useful there. But Reza, you mentioned in the comments something about thermodynamics. What were you talking about?
Well, looking at this formula, you have this famous thermodynamics equation that a system, the amount of energy that goes into a system is equal to the amount of work that the system does plus the heat that the system produces. So this thermodynamic equation seems very much like the Veiling function. Like the Veiling function seems to be a generalization of that, as a matter of fact, because the terms in the right side of the equation in thermodynamics are not discernible within the terms in the left side. So the separation between these terms on the right side is never analyzable from looking at the left side of the equation. And it is obvious, like for example, you get a car, you put some gas in the car and the car runs and it covers a distance, but not all the gas that is spent is actually useful for moving the car. Some of it is transformed into heat or something else. But the gas itself does not contain these two components. These two components appear after. So I was suggesting that probably, I don't know whether the writer, I didn't read that book. Actually, if you can put the link of the book in the group, it would be good. Also, the book that you guys refer to from Hayek, it would be good. So I was making the comment that probably this Veiling function is a way for probably bring the the behavior of the thermodynamic system under the information system. So basically describe that these two systems more or less function in similar ways, or at least is understandable by the same set of equations.
It's interesting also because, I mean, it's well known that Marx used a lot of metaphors from thermodynamics, you know, even like when a lot of mass was actually introduced in Marxism because of this, because he gives two distinct kind of explanations of what he means by labor or work. One that is very clearly a sort of socially historic definition, like labor is a category that requires a bunch of specific historical developments to appear, because there is no such thing as the capacity for labor in general. People only have the capacity to labor on whatsoever after, let's say, that capacity has been abstracted from the capacity to do specific things. And historically, you don't see the term labor being used to describe this sort of indistinct potency up until early capitalist times. And the other one is actually more thermodynamic. He talks about the expenditure of energy by muscles, brain, and so on and so forth. So that seems to be like a natural or a physical approach. And so you get two sorts of Marxists coming out of this. Like the Marxists who say labor is a specific capitalist category, and Marxists who say there is an ontology where labor is a fundamental category of, you know, survival and of transformation of matter into something else that is transhistoric, right? Is a very, and it might even be the definite characteristic of being of humans, right? So and I have the impression that Marx likes he likes two things that he uses. One is thermodynamics, the other is differential calculus as well. Those seems to be like the two main metaphor or main formal resources that seem to interest him at the time and seem to capture something he was trying to explain. And so it would be interesting to find something that has the same properties, like that has similar properties to the things that interested him as means of formalizing important moments of his thinking, but that don't have the same presuppositions. Because, for example, a problem with this sort of thermodynamic approach is that it's very hard to characterize some contemporary forms of work based on the expenditure of energy. Like there's no proportion between the two things, right? You cannot so easily describe intellectual labor based on the amount, like how much it will expend your energy in such a way that you need to buy some things to remain alive, to recuperate the energy you lost, you know?
Yeah, I think we discussed about this. I mentioned that in the manuscript that I wrote. That theory of thermodynamics seems to be well, Lacan loved theory of thermodynamics, as you know as well. I mean, he refers to this in many places. But I think late Lacan, he basically moves toward or moves beyond the thermodynamical metaphors. And with Badiou, we already have a way of thinking beyond the thermodynamic metaphor with theory of generic, because it is not, because in thermodynamic, usually the exergy is understood as inconsistency, right? So you have a certain amount of consistency in the system or somewhere in the resource, say in the amount of energy that is inputting to the system. You get another amount of consistency, which is the working of the system, of the car or machinery or whatever, and then you get a certain amount of inconsistency. The inconsistency that is produced in the system is usually not transferable to any amount of synergy. You cannot capture it. It's pure inconsistency. Whereas we know with the theory of generic that the exergy in this case is not inconsistency, is a new consistency, as a matter of fact. So it would be interesting. So we discussed this in Badiou's discussion of this and the theory of generic, that he has already using mathematics, he went beyond the physical or thermodynamical metaphors. Mathematical metaphors seem to suit him a lot better than thermodynamical.
It's interesting also because there is a parallel there is a parallel between thermodynamic and interpretation of Gödel, right? Where the fact that there are always you can make an equation between your capacity to prove things and the synergy, right? This being, let's say, the amount of propositions in a system, the amount of provable propositions in a system, plus some propositions that are true but not provable, right? You cannot arrive at them through any amount of work, in the sense of deductive work, perhaps, right? You cannot compute them away, right?
Yes, but the point is, if you think axiomatically, then you can turn the exergy into new consistency.
Yeah, because that's what I wanted to get at. That I think that, for example, the interesting thing is that recent theories of work in the physical sense try to emphasize, in order to be able to think work across different substrates. So you don't want to think work as simply as a sort of energy, available energy in a system, because let's say this is a single system interpretation of work, right? So this is workable energy and this is non-workable energy, right? It's just dissipated. It cannot be put to work, right?
Yeah.
This guy called Terence Deacon, I think I mentioned him in our group already, but there are many people working on this. Like their suggestion is that for us to be able to have a concept of work that works across scales and of course across different substrates. So for example, not only thermodynamic work, but morphodynamic work, because one form can change another form. And a form is not reducible, for example, it's a statistic kind of stability. It's like an attractor in a system, but it's not reducible to the actual energy being mobilized by that system. So that you can talk about morphodynamic work, and he calls also teleodynamic work that concerns a sort of, for example, a living system, as it works on its own reparation or reproduction, which is not exactly the same as morphodynamic or thermodynamic. His suggestion is that we should define work in terms of the relation between two systems, right? So work is defined as the capacity of one entropic tendency of a system to produce negentropic tendencies on another, right? So you cannot define, because here is actually energy of one system is equal to the synergy of one system plus the exergy of one system, right? This is actually local. This is not global. This is the formula for like.
Yeah, it's a closed system.
These are closed systems. But to define work, you actually would need a system one that has some expenditure here and some synergy here, right? And to consider its relation with the system two, so that, for example, while this can be losing working capacity, this is actually affecting, so this is moving towards disorder, but it's moving towards disorder can increase the order in this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So work would be, it requires two systems to be describable, not one. And then he says, well, when you move your perspective to this sort of different one, you actually get a concept that applies, that is more freed from the substrate than before, so you can actually apply it to other you can generalize it, right?
Yeah.
Which I think,
I mentioned also that this this is just a local theory of justice. Like it cannot give a global sense because it is always, like you said, honing onto the closed system. But I think at least the sense that I get from Badiou, or as we discussed late Lacan, is the not totally disjoint systems, but it seems that we are moving toward having a system that is included in another system, where part of this exergy becomes the synergy of that system. So exactly like theory of generic. In the theory of generic, you all of a sudden through a generic extension, you get a set that has nameable elements that did not exist in the previous set. Although in this case, for generic set, you're within the same set. It's completely completely going beyond the paradigm of thermodynamic, because in the case of generic, you're dealing with infinite. The system is absolutely non-closed.
Mm-hmm.
I put a link in our chat regarding that there's a lot of research in category theory about open systems, so systems that can be composed together to form new systems, and that's actually the basis of Ellie Adams' work as well, because the whole presupposition is that you have this plus sign that allows you to join two systems together, right? Which means that there needs to be some interaction between them. Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, this idea of exergy as a metaphor for interaction is already, like, it's exactly what we're talking about. So
yeah, actually this here looks like the one system analysis of what in Adams is actually necessarily two systems, right?
Yeah.
I mean, his whole point is that when he makes this equation between what he calls a sandbox for some weird reason and this other thing, that P and S are two different systems, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's so this seems to be the thermodynamic equation seems to be a localization of Veiling function.
Yeah, and I was just going to say about the the original example of like putting the gas in the car and then like some of that energy isn't used, right? So it's wasted. Well, from the capitalist perspective, any amount of wage that you pay to labor that goes beyond the survival of the laborer is exactly like the wasted energy, right? So part of the optimization of considering labor as a machine, it's like you want to extract or reduce all those wasted wages. So it gives that same idea that like if we, I mean, it's an ideological idea as well. It's like if you apply the thermodynamic model to processes of work, then entropy is basically the living quality of labor, I would say, right? It's everything that makes labor not the same as a machine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, so then we could say that the third term, the C term, whether it's cooperation or life, some living organism's capacity to sustain its own form, like morphological work, let's say, then exploring that space is the interesting thing. Like, how do we probe into this third term? And I think Hakel pointed out this thing, like when you modularize the laborers into the, actually both, you guys are talking about how you can take labor and break it up into smaller pieces, right? So then one labor process becomes many smaller gestures, and then this creates alienation, right? Because no one sees the entire process. Also, like, you have no control of the process either. You're just like, you make no decisions. You just
actually you can
part, right?
Yeah, you can actually give a formal definition of alienation as the production of some excess, right, that is not expressible in the system that supposedly produces it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's alienating because I can, as exactly as we said, like, you cooperate, the cooperation produces more than the combined labor produces more than the separate parts, but you cannot assign the excess, you cannot express its place, right? That's what's being called alienation. Like, I can balance this out, but this balance is not expressible in this or this, right? It's not expressible as a function of work. So it's not expressible as a function of these terms.
But just one thing that Dennis was talking about, the effort from capitalists to reduce wages. This is exactly what the general law of accumulation says. You know, it's kind of how the movements of accumulation creates an additional population, so that the wages can be reduced or maintained in a level that it's that is right for capital, you know. So I was just thinking about this. It fits very, very well what you said about
exactly. On the large scale, the entropy of the system is it's like how much you were able to, I don't know, reduce the wages in a way, like the total profit. But then, then the whole contradiction comes with you have crisis, because if the rate of profit has a tendency to fall over time, means it's like saying there's a limit to how much you can reduce wages on the large scale, right? Before, the system becomes unstable.
But I don't know if the tendency of profit rate to fall has something to do with the wages that are being reduced. I think it has something to do about it has something to do with the rising productivity, not the wages, I think. But this is,
I think it's connected, right? Because the rising productivity raises the amount of product per work hour, but the amount of unemployment or the lowering of wages reduces the consumption capacity. So you cannot reabsorb so that's why you have overproduction crisis, right? If people productivity went up and wages went up, people would be able to buy back what they produced. But if productivity goes up and wages go down, you cannot buy back what you're producing. That's the new excess, right? like one thing you guys were saying that I think was perhaps an interesting route to explore, and goes back to what the distinction that Renzo pointed out, right, between coarse graining and actually higher order effects, is that couldn't we perhaps talk about, like, bring this all together, what Raquel said about the sort of accumulative, like a sort of restabilization of capitalist relations at ever higher scales, so at lower and lower resolutions, right? Together with the increase in higher order production, because that seems to be kind of a way to understand this. Like, you get, like, from the perspective of labor and means of production, so the perspective of production, you get actually higher effects, higher order effects. So the combination of machines, the combination of technology, which is a certain, it can be, technology can itself be defined as the actual exploitation of the difference between scales, right? So you learn to harvest power from micro scale phenomena. Even the steam engine is already this, right? You, by understanding the processes that go into combustion and so on, you're able to harvest that power to affect changes at a, say, human level scale, right? Or by learning how to to combine parts of machines in certain ways, you're able to raise the productivity beyond the human scale, and to rate, for example, to explore durations of activities that people wouldn't be able to accomplish on themselves. So there is a sort of actual production of higher order effects, combinations of things, composition of things that actually produce irreducible effects, like their actual emergent effects. But capitalism kind of always chooses a more coarse-grained perspective, where that higher order is kind of balanced out as a sort of natural equation, you know? Like, I'm thinking of something like, from the production side, we would have this sort of compositional effects, right, of interaction. And I think that this concerns both natural systems, natural resources, cooperation, machinery. In all of them, you get this. So, for example, steam engines, they are exploiting the capacity of, or I don't know, hydraulic power is exploiting the entropic tendency of a river in favor of work capacity in a factory, for example, right? Cooperation is exploring how to compose the effective amount of work laborers can do to produce more work than they are able to do on their own. Machinery is also exploiting this sort of phenomena. But then from the standpoint of circulation and commodity exchange, you're constantly reshaping the value form to make this excess appear as a sort of balanced equation. You know, this is just the averaging. This is just a sort of natural addition. You know, the reason why I'm saying this, like, so I'm not sure how to think about this exactly, but so this would have this sort of changing resolution, right? So the actual scale in which the world should be considered is changed in an objective way. But this would be a nice way to account why it is that, the more capitalism involves the whole world into production, so natural resources, exploiting human power to the utmost level, the less it seems to appear from the standpoint of commodities themselves, right? So the more labor becomes a commodity, the less the laborer appears, even though you're exploiting every possible angle of the laborer himself, right? So, I mean, the reason why I'm saying this is because the way that Dennis described it seems like living standards of laborer appears as a kind of unsignifiable residue. Like it doesn't exist as a relevant term, right? There is no price for it. There is no accountability for it, right? It could be seen as a sort of balancing of these two things, right? You produce real higher order effects, meaning that you get a sort of multi-scalar process that involves natural, human, and a sort of, I don't know how you want to call this, sort of technological stacking of scales. And then when you get to price and commodity relations, they're all kind of flattened back, right? And you need to flatten them in accordance with a certain thing you're looking for. You don't want to flatten them anyway. You want to flatten all these different levels from the perspective where that difference, which we call the price difference or the profit difference, is legible, right? So you're changing resolution to keep up with, you know, that relevant difference. I'm not sure if this is, again, this is my slogan for today. I'm not sure if this is making any sense, but, you know, like,
yeah, I feel like I understand the first part, that you have different ways of composing, almost like that plus sign on the left of the equation. You can actually have many different plus signs, right? Can have like an index. We can write a little I underneath it to show like there's different ways you can compose it, and depending on which you choose, you can actually produce different compositional effects, right? Generative effects. And then, but then what I don't understand is the keeping up part. Like when you map it back to price, what do you mean that we're keeping up with something?
like because what is the strategy that distinguishes the two things, right? This strategy here is saying that if I change from a small scale to a large scale, I can actually get more information, right? Sometimes the effective information here is actually higher than here, right? So you can get more info, right? And what you did here is a function of abstracting. But this is different from this, because this is actually saying that there are certain operators. This is not a change in scale proper, or not in the same sense, right? This is not, you have the same system S, and then you choose the size of your state space. It's not an abstracting process in that sense. This is actually an increase in composition, right? You're actually increasing, because this state space is literally, is materially smaller than this one. You're not abstracting to make this difference, right? So I'm just trying to, I would call this, I would call the first, the thing that Hoek explores a sort of, abstractive veiling, right? You literally lose information or lose resolution to gain information, right? I cannot distinguish anymore all the states of that transition matrix, but I can now have more information about the transition, right? It's a trade-off between resolution and information.
Whereas, yeah, you know, it makes kind of sense, like how this relates to wages, because like, take for example, like Uber, right? Uber is making a lot of money. Well, yeah, it's I think it's still negative overall, but it makes a ton of profit, and then it could say, oh, we were making this profit because we came up with a new way of organizing workers and our technology is superior and so on. But actually, you could also say that this is a form of coarse graining, because it no longer counts its employees as workers in the old sense, right? Because it doesn't actually pay the workers for health insurance and so on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like all the benefits that you would normally have with a long-term job. I mean, this applies to any like gig economy job where the coarse graining comes with how you count the labor itself. Like if you count it as an official employee in the old sense, or whether it's like you only count it as like a contractor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're changing how you cover the social relations. You're not really changing the social relations, right?
Yeah, and so, in that sense, wage, originally it was already that way, right? Because wage implies that your productive hours are the only things that count. Like your productive 8 or 10 hours you spend in working, but it doesn't count like the time you spend at home recovering, or the time you of education and so on. And so what I wanted to suggest with this is that I would call this an abstraction, exactly as you said, right? And this thing here actually increases the power. And I mean, that's the play here, because it's actually the power set. So it's an increased power, quite literally. There are more possibilities than before.
And causal power also, right?
Yeah, increasing causal power. So here the trade-off is different, right? It's like you get more composition, like you get more possibilities, which is not the same. So, and more resolution, like you have more names, more possible states. So the state space is actually bigger. It's not smaller, right? Than here. Here there is a trade-off between the state space and the information. And here it doesn't seem to be the same thing. And what I was trying to suggest is that perhaps there is something we can, perhaps one way of thinking this constant move that Raquel was also mentioning is to talk about, in the productive level, you have this inequality concerns the increasing power. Whereas the absorption of the representation of this in the social world is actually based on the coarse graining.
Yeah.
This would, this sort of differentiation, which I'm not sure how I would account for it, but this differentiation would help to suggest that we can explain why it is that the more layers are involved in production, and the more, let's say, stakeholders you have, like nature, the commons of all sorts of informational commons, natural commons, whatever you want, right? The more these things are being brought into play to increase the power at the productive level, the way that this is displayed back is as if it's from the perspective of choosing a new resolution, new scale of description, where this is normalized. Like this disappears as a generative thing and becomes just something that adds up, right?
Now, another way of saying that is what Marx says is that the exchange of equalities in the market just can only be sustained by the exchange of inequalities in the production. You have this kind of relation between them. But I think what you are trying to do is to find what these two scales have in common. And I think we can think about the how can I say, the role that Marx gives to average to think about something in common between them, because when you are in the market and you are thinking about value, the kind of labor that creates value is the average labor. And when you are inside the production, inside the process of production, you also, this is what I was trying to say before, because when this social force emerges in the production, the workers are kind of average representation of something too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is the common thing about in the two scales. The both scales, Marx is thinking about something in the average. When you are in the market is the kind of labor that creates value is the average labor, and when you are in the production, the kind of worker that is created by the social forces, a worker that has to work according to the average that the mechanism imposes to him.
Yeah, I think a good way of concretely thinking about that is saying something like, it's true that, I mean, you can only understand the value of labor if you treat labor is a commodity, right? So if labor is commodity, so labor equals commodity. So the producer of commodity is seen as a commodity. So that's kind of seeing labor from afar. You're not interested in the concrete differences of each labor or concrete differences in what they're producing. You're treating them as commodities. But then this change in resolution will affect how you treat labor in the production process. So once you treat labor as an indistinct capacity to do whatever, you can decompose labor, you can combine labor, because it's just an indistinct thing, right? Nothing would prevent you from combining laborers in the way that perhaps previously you wouldn't look at them in that way, right? So you get a sort of thing like this, right? And this allows you to combine labor in a different way, which again makes more commodities appear, which then reinforces that labor is just a commodity of this new type. Then this reinforces how you treat labor, right? But that seems to be kind of, I'm not sure how to describe this, but in some sense it seems to be to me that it kind of connects these two ways of thinking about how to produce something that was not there before, right? By an abstraction of information versus a combination of available things such that their combination has something that their separate parts didn't have.
Now it makes a lot more sense, because the commodity form is like its essence is to coarse grain, right?
Yeah,
the whole point is, given a series of things, the commodity form is to say that they're all the same, they're all one type of thing. So when you apply that logic to labor, you create exactly the effects that you guys are talking about with the ideal worker, the ideal commodity, the ideal, like, kind of this averaging process that also means that everyone's kind of replaceable as well, right? Like substitutable.
Yeah, I actually think that, we've spoke about this in our last Badiou meeting, this sort of idea that one of the properties of language or natural language is that it doesn't really distinguish between realms, right? Like it cuts across different systems as if they're all the same. So it's kind of like one of these effects of language that leads analytic philosophy to be forever trying to find the proper place of concepts and the uses, and to regionalize and find the right reference to whatever concepts, uses, and terms, and so on and so forth. Like this capacity of language of, not really caring for keeping the small and the large, and allowing the large to be compared with the small and put everything in the same kind of destratified field, right? That gives a different meaning to what Marx says when he talks about the language of commodities, right? I mean, perhaps we could understand what he says, like the language of commodities, meaning that commodities share with language the property of not making that distinction, right? So it's like a free it's like a language in the sense that it will always always de-stratify things that were previously stratified or regionalized, right?
I think thinking this like using like this vertical movement of abstraction and kind of like horizontal movement of increasing in power, like it makes it eligible also like why cooperation is problematic, right? Because cooperation you have the scale at which composition works and you get increasing power in power is the same as the level of workers. So you get like the word of workers appears to itself. So it's kind of like the scale of work is the same scale of appearance, and that's I think the same for like in IIT and I think Badu also you have the way in which power maps appearance in a sense. So what you would need in order to not get this increase in power without getting this appearance in the same, you use abstraction. So you go up, so and then maintain this causal power in a sense. But in order to do this, it's interesting because you have to kind of like refunctionalize this lower level, which is kind of related to the passage to manufacture. And I don't know if it's making sense, but you have like this interesting argument about like why computers are not consciousness is because they are like they don't integrate information because they're like feed forward. So you can always kind of like, so what I imagine is like you have like this kind of like cooperative system and you kind of transform it into like a machine that doesn't integrate information, right? So you refunctionalize, so you organize a factory and like a line of production, or you use like gig work and all these kind of like processes of reorganizing like the productive forces in order for these compositional effects appear in another scale. Like they are like they're refunctionalized in a way that you preserve power, but this power is kind of like raised to this other scale of appearance, which is capital and commodities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because I remember when you were presenting this, and also in the IIT 3.0 text, they mentioned this, that one of the critiques to IIT is that you can always turn this sort of integrated, you can always make it equivalent to some feed-forward system, right? So it would seem like you can always, so it's again, it's like you have something that appears here, and it implies an inequality with regards to the parts. But you can always come up with an equivalent description where you just have we have more terms in a feed-forward additive system, right?
It's a different implementation in which you preserve like the total sum, but
yeah, I mean, I'm having the impression that understanding exactly, I mean, I'm not sure, Dennis, if this is something you can talk about now, but I have the impression that understanding exactly how this is constructed, right? What allows for this to be constructed would be interesting, because the very fact that this is constructed in a categorical sense, that you can calculate this additional term that has the same, that is, I'm not sure up to what it is identical to the thing that was lost by the veiling. But since it is in category theory, it seems to be always an extrinsic construction, right? It would be interesting to understand, I mean, this could explain, let's say, a sort of the reason why it is effective to change the description and reacquire the information while actually truly losing something, right? It's equivalent in the sense that something has been balanced out, and something was added that balances this out. But the fact that something was added doesn't mean that there's only one thing you could add to balance it out, right? So for example, if you're not interested in the property of integrated information, so if you don't consider it a primitive of what needs to be explained or to be accounted for, you just want to account for information in general, you're satisfied with the fact that this balances it out. And you say, see, I found something that does the same thing. But if you take this inequality to be the thing that you want to account for, right? The inequality is not the defect. The inequality is the very thing to be demonstrated. Even though you balance this out, you're not satisfied. Like this is like say, the solution to the wrong problem, right? So this, we could be able to, depending on how this is done, we could actually get with this a theory of how do you make something cohesive again or consistent again without not like making it consistent through mystifying it in a certain sense. Like, yes, this added thing balances this out. It has the properties that you would be looking for, but it doesn't mean that it, let's say, it brings to light the cause of the thing that was causing the inequality, right? I mean, that example you gave of the feed forward system, I think it's nice because it has that kind of that kind of underlying strategy, right? It says, look, if I can reduce this back to just a bunch of coupled parts, then I have no need of accepting that there is something which is integrated, that there's self-existing or it has some causal power on its own, right? That seems similar to saying, if I can add a term called, for example, the profit rate, that actually makes this system cohesive, I don't need to account for the idea that there is some form of surplus labor produced by corporation, because both systems being consistent, why choose the one with the craziest premise? I can just choose the one with the computable premise, right? I'm not sure if, again, okay, I'm not going to repeat my disoriented
Motto.
Yeah, my motto, but yeah.
I think this is really good. The way the paper calculates this third term is using cohomology theory, which is about obstacles in space, which is why in the presentation I was showing like one example was that Penrose triangle, right? Mm-hmm. And the cohomology theory for that would be like it would be quantifying in some sense why why there is this incompatibility between the three pieces, right? In what sense? Like, I mean, when you map this, like take for example a Penrose triangle or any complicated space, if you map it to 2 dimensions, I mean, on one level it's not really paradoxical because it's just points on a page, right? It's only our eyes that perceive a paradox in their gluing. Mm-hmm. But a machine, for example, a machine, if you tell it to draw a Penrose triangle, it doesn't have any problem doing that, right? It's just points on a 2-dimensional surface. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So something about our eyes perceives this higher order obstacle. And so I think it's similar with this notion of like generative labor or surplus labor, where the capitalist is perceiving with a lower dimensional eye by looking at the prices of production, right? Is like a lower dimensional eye that, like you said, it simplifies the picture so that there is no like non-trivial there's no non-trivial like distortion in space, which is why I think that's why the notion of like space would help a lot, because so far we've been thinking of like prices, so like a single number, which is a very poor space. But if we can think of a richer space, like a space with holes in it, or with like a twist or something like that, then you have a richer idea of what the third term is. It's like something that prevents, let's say, like a circle from becoming a point in a space. I mean, that gets closer to what I think the paper is trying to get to.
Yeah, because my question would be the following. Like, I imagine that and this is something perhaps, I'm not sure if this is easily something you can talk about or if we should look more into it, but I remember it has something to do with this idea. Okay, you can recuperate the loss of exactness, right? Exactness. That's one way that he describes this, and the other, he talks also about you can recover the potential, like the potential for generative effects, right? C is also a measure of this potential, right? The loss of exactness description suggests that you're, let's say, recuperating the thing that was lost, right? But the potential for generative effects description suggests that the thing that, whatever comes here, says something about the quality of this inequality, right? Well, if this, I mean, very simply, like if this is a very large term, this means that this is had a lot of power of generating interactional effects, right? If this is a very small addition, then this had a very low capacity for generating generative effects. That seems like, I mean, that seems more like it's not only, let's say, a term for balancing an equation, but also, I mean, it's not only that you find the solution for an equation, but also that you find something that has information about the function, right? It says something about this function, depending on what goes here. So the reason why I'm asking this is because one thing is to say, yeah, for example, prices of production, they involve balancing this out. Another thing is saying that there are a whole class of terms that could balance this out, and we should distinguish them on through another perspective, you know? For example, what we were saying now, like, yeah, you might balance this, you might be able to reproduce everything that goes into an integrated system through a sort of feed-forward description of it. But you didn't say anything about, like, we didn't learn anything about the inequality that we had. Like, it's a very, it does very well the job of making it consist as an equality, but it doesn't do a good job from other perspectives, right? So depending on how this third term, I mean, if in Adam's description, this is something that can be constructed in many ways, right? Perhaps they're all equivalent from the perspective of making this equal, but they might be different from some other perspective, you know?
Yes, that's a good point, yeah.
I think there's another way to like kind of recover this term. I'm not sure in the context of Adam's works, but if you think about like not only about the spaces in which we were talking about, but also this a space of functions of 5 functions. By varying this function, you can learn a lot about how these 2 spaces relate themselves, right? So if you can parameterize this function, and so one good metaphor is like, you have like, I remember you have, so the problem of from like X-rays to do like a tomography, you have like a certain like a ray, it goes through like something that's thick and has volume, and you just receive on the other side like an average density, right? When you do like an X-ray. But if you the how do you say, like the thing about tomography is that you use this ray which can only see like one value instead of like all the values of densities across the body by varying the X-ray all across your body, so in many directions. And then you can infer from this kind of low dimensional signals the whole like 2D densities of your body. And that's also at work, I think, with phi, because if you think like you have different phis, different like phi functions for different cuts, you also like for measuring the real irreducibility and the real C term, what you actually do is explore like this phi space, which is the space of cuts, and look for the minimal one. So the cut that makes the minimal difference is like the minimal amount that you're obliged to admit into existence, which is like what's the minimum C that you cannot like deny that exists, because otherwise you're just like picking like a veiling function that's kind of like overestimating the C value, because it's just so I mean
I love that. You know, I mean, I remember in the chat in the WhatsApp group we mentioned like strikes as a sort of way of cutting. I wonder if this isn't a good way, you know, like if you have a cooperating process that produces some surplus, right? You can say like, no, let's add the capitalist venture as a term that balances this out, right? It's workers working plus the capitalist, and that's what makes the equation balance out. But you can do a strike and cut the capitalist out and show that it, you know, it still has most of the surplus in it. So that would be like a investigation of the system that shows that part is not really essential for the surplus.
Police that comes up and tries to like cut relevant factors of the production and see if it makes a difference or not.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a nice way of distinguishing it, right? Because it's very metaphorical, but I think it's very evocative, because unemployment is a way of showing that people are replaceable. So everyone is replaceable, therefore they're not essential for a surplus, right? Productivity is also a way of cutting something where it seems like machines, you can change a machine and lose people and keep the same surplus. So in that sense, people are not essential, right? And strikes are a different way of cutting the thing, because they do suggest that the thing that is actually irrelevant is neither the worker nor the machine, but the guy who owns the stuff. But that, I think that's more an evocative idea than something kind of
yeah, it's really good. I mean, yeah, I think that's where our most fruitful stuff is yet to come, like how different ways of exploring this object C. But I just wanted to comment also that this idea of varying the parameters of the veil, or varying the veil and then seeing like after you perturb the veil, how the C value changes. This is actually a nice way to think of the Yoneda lemma that Yasha was presenting last time, because that's the whole point of Yoneda, is that an object is summarized by the functions into or out of so how you transform it, right? Either something to it or transform the object to something else, right? So if you have this interaction, let's say between two workers, or between a worker and a machine or whatever, and you're trying to study that, then all the possible ways that you can transform that relation, so basically all the different veils, that will tell you about the object, right? So you don't actually need to know the object ontologically. You can discover the object through perturbing it. That's a nice way of thinking of the Yoneda lemma. It's just perturbations of an object.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure I follow. I mean, the Yoneda lemma, I follow it in the sense that it says, like, the very coarse grain understanding that it's saying that there is an equivalence between the object and all the functions to the object, all the functors to the object, right?
Yeah, it could be functors or functions, yeah.
Okay. All the arrows to the object, but I don't understand that second part. Like how is this related to the veiling functions?
I just mean if instead of having only one veil, which tells us only one thing about C, we can actually come up with a whole set of veils. And by looking at all the veils, each veil tells us a little bit more about C. So in some sense, C is just the sum of all the veils, all the information from all the veils.
Nice. I think I understand that.
Yeah, assuming that like, yeah, C is kind of changing depending on what veil you chose. So like the price system, let's say the price system is one kind of veil, and now you look at the price of a certain thing, it tells you a little bit about this C, but actually we've been saying, it doesn't really capture what's essential to C, which is the real power of composing labor together.
So in this case, it makes a lot of sense because this goes to the essence of the category theory as an extrinsic kind of paradigm.
Exactly, it's the extrinsic paradigm, yeah, of studying this.
So you wanna understand the system, you have to create different veils so that through those veils you can build another system that you can study.
I think there's almost a literal metaphor similar to the tomography one, which is like you have like an object, a 3D object, and then you like point like a flashlight, and then you see the shadow. And then if you change like the position from where you're like
seeing the object,
seeing the object, just by looking at the shadow, you should be able to know what.
But isn't this very similar to like the modeling? The modeling not modeling in terms of Badiou, but modeling in terms that Levi-Strauss explains. That you have some sort of system, and you create a simplification of that system, and then you explore that simplification. Or maybe not simplification is not the word. It's a model of that system that you.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to reconstruct the system by studying its models.
Yeah. So rather than going from rather than doing this, and then and then trying to find this inverse arrow here, right? From what I understand, we're saying that S is actually kind of equal to all the possible arrows that it can have to P, to some system. Is that it?
Yeah.
So if this is the object, right, as Renzo was saying, and the veiling function is, let's say, the flashlight seeing it from here, right? This is S, and it has a shadow here. The set of all possible perspectives on the object, right? So all the possible phi functions on it, the set of these functions exhausts the object.
Exactly, and we can actually make it a little simpler on ourselves because we can ignore veils that don't produce C, right? Don't produce, because some veils might not actually produce a generative effect.
Mhm.
So we can kind of count them as not important, because really what we want to find is a C, right? We want to actually look at C, but all we have is S. So it's like maybe a two-step process there. Like,
Yeah, I was thinking like it could because it seems to me that it's important to think. It's almost like this, right? This is the operation inside, right? This is the veiling to P, and this is what that inequality is saying is that this doesn't commute, right? Like operating this and then this is not the same as operating this.
for a single veil or for many veils?
For
If
a
it's
single,
for a
right?
single,
For the inequality that basic thing like this, right? So right, this is saying that something doesn't commute, right? Moving from this term, like operating this and then mapping it to P is not the same as mapping it to P and then operating inside of P, right?
So there is an arrow missing in your diagram.
Yeah, my
You also
diagram.
have an arrow. You have to have an arrow from P to P with the plus sign with no circle.
Yeah, so it's like this. Sorry, yeah. Can somebody do it for me, please?
I think this is what it should be like. Shit, it's really hard to do this. Need to use the mouse. And then this is S1, S2, P1, P2, and then this is P1 plus P2, and this is S1 plus S2. And we're saying that there is no, this does not commute. This does not commute.
Yeah, so to add C is to make this commute, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean,
adding C makes this commute. Yeah.
So in terms of arrow, if you wanted to represent that in a categorical diagram, what are the objects that C operate on?
Well, C would be another object, I guess, in.
Or will not be an arrow?
No, C will be an object that it would be like, we could just make it another point. Like, where's annotate? Yeah, it would just be like this, right? Like, yeah. Then it would commute. Then this would become P1 plus P2 plus C, right? So P1 plus P2 plus C, and then this arrow would go here. So you have the component objects, which are P1, P2, and C, and then you have arrows, which are inclusion arrows into a bigger object, P1 plus P2 plus C. And then because you've constructed this bigger object, now the veil that goes from S1, S2, S1 plus S2 can now commute with everything.
This is like linearizing the veiling function, right?
Are these arrows? Well, they're same. Okay, so the arrows between S1 and S2, there are morphism, but there are arrows between S1 and P1 are functors, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Then that part is not completely. You're not supposed to mix morphisms with functors, but yeah, this is like an approximation of.
Yeah, just to bring this back to why this is relevant, it's just because it seems to me that when we first discussed this project, one of the things we were talking about, it seemed like a big emblem of the idea was, and I think Apolito was relevant for this, but it's also a broader thing, was that we spoke about two benefits, I think, of this sort of this new theoretical space, right? One thing we wanted from it, which we already mentioned, is a sort of space that is broad enough to include within the same framework concepts that concern organization and concepts that concern political economy, right? So one of our basic premises was that there is a sort of gap between our discourse on political organization and our discourse on political economy, which makes, for example, the first very moral, very individual, very subject-driven in a informal sense, right? Whereas the second is structural, is irreversible, or some sort of dissituated, and so on. And we thought, well, if you want to turn political organization into something more effective in the actual contemporary world, you need to be able to make this jump, right? And to integrate these two discourses a bit more. And the second part, which we also mentioned, which I think is what comes into this question of C, is that we wanted to regionalize capitalism, capitalist social formation, right? In the sense that you want money and you want the price system to look like a local solution to a broader problem that could have other solutions, right? So rather than equate, because your theoretical system is not powerful enough to express multiple solutions, it's actually build from that particular solution. You build your analysis of capitalism in such a way as to explain what money is. Like, that's your core problem. Because that's the core problem, all the concepts revolve around that one empirical object, right? Or that one historical object. It's a different thing when you construct a system, a theoretical space, that allows you to recompose the Marxist critique of political economy, but it is richer so that the price system appears as a particular solution with some benefits and some caveats that you can then say, well, but there are better solutions, right? So regionalization here has a very strong meaning. It's not simply one amongst many, because the moment that money appears as a local solution, or the price systems appears as a local solution, rather than having a figure of revolution as this sort of break with a consistency, you can talk about revolution or social change in terms of finding a more complete solution to a poor solution, right? Which I think is something that Badiou is very, my opinion, he's the big proponent of that sort of approach. But I think that this clarifies why it's interesting to understand this a bit better. Because if our current hypothesis is that we can say a lot, like there is some potential in formalizing surplus in terms of interactional inequality, right? The interaction between, the composition between these two terms actually yields more than their separate consideration, right? If this proves to be a good hypothesis, and if the if this proves to be a good hypothesis, it fits well with the first idea, because, well, that's a principle that can be applied to small and large scale. It's a principle that gives, let's say, scaling is not a hidden variable in it, right? Because this process of abstracting, this process of increasing power, it's explicitly connected with changes in resolution, expansion in state space or causal power, and so on. But it also, if that second equation where we add the C to the linearization, depending on how it's defined, and we should look into it, it might also apply to the second case, right? Because if the properties of C are not, if this doesn't mean that there is a single coveil or whatever he calls it, I forget now. I think he calls it like that, right? The sort of inverse function that gives you back the exactness you lost. If there is a bunch of ways of making this diagram commute, suddenly you can perhaps start treating price as one balancing addition in a larger class of ways of doing it, right? I'm saying this just to make clear the connection between this and this underlying project, right? So this is not like crazy nerd, not purely crazy nerd stuff. Like, this actually would have some bearing on this underlying stuff.
You could fool me.
Yeah, so I mean, in my opinion, that this question here.
So there are a lot of underlying. I mean, this relates apparently to many different fields. It apparently has to do with category theory, with information theory, with thermodynamics. There are many different underlying theories that can either draw from it or enrich it. But the original writing for this is whose? You presented this is a doctoral thesis?
Yeah, the Generative Effects is Eli Adam is the author.
Right.
Eli Adam or Eli Adam, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I can post the link after the call.
How did you come across it?
It's referenced in the 7 sketches to category theory, right? The 7 sketches introduction to category theory. They open the text saying that this is like an interesting application of category theory.
There you go. That's such a strong hint.
Yeah, exactly. It's very rich in its connections. Yeah, actually, I found the part of the text actually where he talks about C, but he actually characterizes it in terms of a functor, I think. So I can share my screen.
Not an object.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different ways we can characterize it. I think C is one way, but it's maybe more formally accurate or something to use another functor. Gabriel, can you give me the sharing power?
Sorry.
Just 1 second. Yeah, can you see this?
Yeah. Proposition 665.
Yeah, if you go to his text, it's called Systems, Generativity, Interactional Effects. Yeah, this proposition says, let G be a functor. If G explains the veil, then there exists this crazy diagram. Okay, yeah, we don't need to go into this, but it's expressed in a category theory way, right? That no matter what path you take in this diagram, you get the same morphism.
Mhm.
Right, which is, it's interesting because it's a morphism that goes from 0 back to 0. So it's like
So the arrows downward are also morphisms, not functors. They're all morphisms.
these are all morphisms.
Yeah, they
G
are
is a
independent.
G is a functor, and H is a functor.
Mhm.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I'm not sure if this actually clarifies anything.
Not for me.
Yeah, but this one is interesting because he says that he's trying to talk about memory. Like if you look at a system and you try it, and certain effects of the system can only be explained if that system remembered something from the previous interactions with it. Like that might not be, you know, completely clear from just looking at the first order effects of something, right? You cannot tell if something has memory. It could just be a random process or like a Markov process. This G functor can explain or can prove that that the system has memory. Okay. Yeah.
H also is a universal functor that explains.
Yes, it's the only, or it's the unique functor that explains it. Yeah.
I remember somebody said this is not a geeky thing.
I didn't say it's not geeky, but I'm just saying it has a purpose, you know. Which I think, I mean, I'm just saying this again because I think it's important just to put all of this into context. Like, and I feel like this is from the perspective of what we've been doing in the Badiou group. It makes sense because we've just read a book that tries to give a very, very vague or very minimal description of what worlds in general abide to in order for you to be able to formalize something like an objective phenomenology that doesn't imply a constitutive subject, but it's very minimal. And in a certain sense, we're interested in adding more restrictions to make it into a formalism that is applicable to some more specific phenomena, right? But we're trying to measure this restriction so that it's still not, let's say, purely describing what Marx did, because Marx was trying to, as we were saying, like, he does construct the categories in such a way as to describe a monetary economy based on labor, like the value theory of labor and so on and so forth, right? So that's, let's say, Marx theoretical space. So we're trying to use all these formalisms and these conceptual tools to come close to what political economy did, but not totally coincide with the critique of political economy, because we want some of its concepts to be localized or to be situated rather than be the general form of the problem, right? So for example, a way of talking about this that doesn't go through formal means is, how do you define social coordination of production and consumption in a more general way than you would define it through decentralized price systems, right? Because those are the description that is perfectly adequate for the price system would be a description of one single system, one simple way of working. So you want to have tools that are richer so that you can describe that as a one way of stabilizing or solving this problem, but in such a way that you could also include other solutions within the same theoretical space, right? So I think that those two properties that we're looking for in this theoretical space, I think one can be called a sort of scaling issue, right? Between local organization and or global or delocalized economy. So we want to be able to bridge that gap, but we also want to be able to bridge the gap between description and prescription. We don't want those to be two separate systems, one that describes capitalism and a separate thing that prescribes something else. We want those two things to also be more integrated, so that when you talk about capitalism, you talk about, let's say, a kind of a prescription, a possible solution to a problem, but not the only solution, right? So I think that's the approach. Those are the two problems that makes all this more formal discussion relevant. Though I don't think those are the only ways to talk about this. Like I don't think we should actually solely focus on that. I mean, it's very hard, in my opinion, to find the conceptual language that takes those two things into account. And I don't think, for example, that Badiou has a good language to talk about it. I think we've discussed this a lot, right? That sometimes, even though he has a very continuous conceptual structure, in the sense that a description of a situation and a transformation of that situation, they are actually quite connected. They use the same concepts and they're totally qualitatively continuous. You don't have two theories. His rhetorical discussion of these things is very rupture-based, very heroic, very kind of capitalism is desituated, connected to the state, and politics is connected to people. And, you know, Red Army in the Chinese mountains. Like, there are practically no discussions of politics that carry over to the political process the qualities of an economic process, right? So it's hard to find, and I don't think that there is a conceptual language to talk about these things as well. So there should be many sources of discussion. And for example, that's why I think Bogdanov is a relevant reference for us, because he was a Marxist that tried to do that. He tried to say, well, labor is actually a form of organization. So economy is actually derivative of the problem of organization, and organizational practices therefore are very similar to these big social formations. They have many properties in common. You should know how to explore them and so on. So that's a non-formal, more conceptual way of discussing the same thing. So I think we also need to, I mean, if we don't develop that other side in parallel with a formal discussion, I think it's sometimes hard even to take benefit of the formal stuff, right? Because it just becomes kind of a rabbit hole of its own, and it's hard to say, okay, this is where we should explore because this is going to be useful. Of course, it's hard to do that because, I mean, these things need to be studied in their own terms, right? You cannot be so utilitarian about them, but that does seem to be some sort of balance we need to kind of work through, you know?
Yeah, this is where Badiou is interesting, because his notion of the body, which I think we're going to talk more about tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
But his notion of the body is exactly like it's a way to bring formalism down to the ground, right? It's a way to ground formalism in an actual working group of people, let's say. I mean, politically speaking, it could be an organization, but through this organization, you are expressing a formalism that is at least as strong as, you know, a model of the ZFC or something like that, right? It can express things like, you know, deductive or implication inside of the organization. So I think that's also interesting. That
one thing that I think is totally connected with that, and that Caron and I were talking about in our class from last week in Portuguese, the class we're teaching on Badiou, is that there's always this question that people ask, like, okay, Badiou talks about worlds, but where do worlds come from? And so how about the genetics of worlds, right? And when we were discussing how to answer this question, I realized something I never really thought so explicitly about, but I think it has a lot to do with his general approach, which is that generally you don't explain. I mean, when something is a world, meaning when it is the very framework within which phenomena happen, you're never able to explain this framework. So scientifically, to explain a framework is to turn it into a phenomena of a different frame, right? So for example, if you want to explain life, and there is something like the life world, it's not a good way of asking the question, how does the life world appear or emerge? Because you're trying to explain this as a framework within which phenomena appear. You're not trying to explain it as a phenomena in a different frame, which has the conditions for that appearance, right? It seems to me that this sort of, for example, geometrizations, right? The transformation of properties of a coordinate system into local properties of a different sort of theoretical space, and other sort of explanatory processes like this, they all have that tendency, or they all use that strategy. Like, you need to situate something in something else in order to make it treatable, amenable to explanation. Otherwise, you're trying to explain the condition of appearance of the thing you're trying to explain at the same time. You know, like you get trapped into this sort of problem. And I think that Marx's historization of capitalism is something like this. Like, if you posit capitalism as a delimited system in time and space, then you can start explaining something about it. But when you treat it as a sort of general framework that was always there, you get the sort of ideological explanations, as in people are naturally, they have a natural tendency towards barter, and that's where money comes from, or there is a general subjective tendency towards this and that. That's why capitalism exists. Like, you need a metaphysical explanation, right? So to avoid metaphysical explanations in general, you need to turn it into a physics means to situate it, right? To make it contingent on something else. If you want to explain something which is not contingent on anything else, you simply cannot discuss it in causal terms to begin with. So I think that this whole idea of regionalizing also has an effect of this sense, right? To make the categories a smaller case of a larger situation is also to turn them into phenomena and not simply into the general frame within which phenomena appear, something like that. So I think that that's also another way of discussing why it's important to you know, come up with a way to give this step back, you know, into something slightly richer or slightly larger in terms of what you're talking about, you know.
Perhaps another way of saying this is, well, in Badiou's project, both in Being an Event and Logics of Words, he has adopted a framework for explanation or exploration, but for a particular purpose. Like, he used set theory in order to describe ontology, and he's using he's using category theory in order to describe phenomenology. So he has a very, to your earlier point, he has a very concrete, like Dennis said, a bodily kind of purpose to such an abstract effort. So otherwise his effort could be a very abstract thing, but he had a very concrete goal in mind by adopting that. But what I understand from what this project is we want to kind of mimic what Badiou has done by adopting a framework for formalization in order to basically explain the inner working of a particular concrete problem. So I guess in this case, we should consider ourselves very, very lucky by having such a great master who has done this, like not just once, but twice.
But you know, like one thing that is becoming clear to me is that, I mean, because one of the things that I think is like one way of framing this idea that you're going to make the descriptive and the prescriptive unified and turn, for example, price into a local solution for a bigger problem is that you don't want to talk about politics in a capitalist world. You want to talk about capitalism in a communist world. So you want the space of what is possible to be larger. So it includes free association as a possibility. It includes some other stuff as a possibility. And a region of that, which we call a temporal slice, which is current time, that's called capitalism. But it's different from what Badiou does, which is to say, his situated analysis is never a global situation. It's always, let's say, politics happened in China. So what's the Chinese situation? But when you localize it into China, you miss capitalism. You get colonialism, you get some other stuff. But the situation you're breaking out of or that you're intervening upon is not the global situation, right? And I think that this makes sense. I mean, there's a really good text by a guy called Etienne Balibar, where he talks about, he calls 3 types of universality. And he says that it is actually quite curious and quite weird that the whole discussion on universals in philosophy has been settled by demographics, in the sense that we can actually know when we say every man is mortal, how many men we're talking about. Like there's actually a global, like the globality and universality have been distinguished. For example, you get a universal statement more from, let's say, ecological activists who say you're responsible for people who haven't been born yet, than from globalization, which concerns everyone who is in the world today. Like, in a certain sense, there is a particular situation which includes 7 billion people, right? Perhaps capitalism doesn't include 7 billion people, but it includes pretty much those 7 billions, right? That is a local situation. That's not a global situation. Like, and for Badiou, there's never the discussion of that world as a sort of local version of something. Capitalism is usually a sort of background. It's never, let's say, it never falls into the picture, I think. You know, so the sort of, yeah.
Transposing this to Badiou's conception of generic procedures is then to inquire the discourse, if you will, the discourse about capitalism, the prescription or description, or which probably we can also call the composition and disposition of a particular discipline whose concern is capitalism. We need to understand what truth procedure does it belong to. It may not necessarily belong, that discipline may not necessarily be politics.
Why not?
Because of what you said earlier, because for Badiou, politics is always situated.
No, but
right?
This is a situation. The planet Earth is a situation.
Oh, this is what you mean by making the situation or the situated thing large enough so you can.
Yeah, I mean that's where I think that's the difficulty with, let's say, not political economy, but an economical politics, right? A politics that includes economical exchange and structure as something that you're experimenting with, and not simply separating yourself from. For example, I think that definitely, in my opinion, we don't have the proper concepts for this yet, but ecological crisis is something that concerns a larger universe than the universe of all people who are living now, right? It concerns, so it situates the world population into one situation, because I can actually come up with something that is situated and larger than it and frames it, which is not only the current ecosystem, but the future, the ecosystem of the future of the planet and the people who are not born yet. So that's actually a larger situation, which is an extension of the world population considered as a global economic system, right? The whole Anthropocene discussion is actually bringing that perspective into play, but in my opinion, in a totally metaphysical way for now. Like,
Yeah.
it makes it look like it doesn't make you look at
discussion.
Yeah, it's kind of anthropological. It doesn't make you look at anything in the
academic.
world. Yeah, you don't look at the world with finer. You don't get to extract anything new from the way that's currently being discussed, in my opinion. Like, at least the common sense. Like, but that's just to say that because of, I think, Badiou's personal investment in particular procedures are more like, you know, worker organizations, and the economic discourse was very much a desubjectivizing discourse in France in the 70s. Like, party people, militants in communist parties were using the discussion of economy to say, yeah, just leave it be and things will change, or we should actually negotiate with the capitalists right now and undo this novelty because of economic reasons. And Mao Zedong made a critique of Stalin because Stalin was being economicist and doing away with subjectivity. But that is a historical contingency. That's not a structural necessity. So when you want to start thinking about political experiments that actually take advantage of impersonal relations, decentralized structures, transnational exchange, or even, you know, climate problems, you suddenly need to be able to occupy a position where the planet is something inside something else and not the frame, right? So it becomes the phenomena, or a composition of many phenomena, and not the frame that makes phenomena appear.
Yeah, it becomes a world.
Yeah, it's inside a world, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, I think that's what communists, like the cosmo-communists of early Soviet Union, they had that intuition, right? The proper way of looking at the planet is from outer space. Kind of, if you have that idea of a huge universe that belongs to the communist endeavor, then the planet becomes a local problem, right?
And you know, the nice thing about this interpretation, in my view, another nice thing is that it really fits within Badiou's framework, because then the situation becomes a situation because of the type of engagement you have with it. So in our case, if, like, borrowing the term Anthropocene, right now, the scale of our engagement with, or the type of dilemma that we are engaging with, is really concerning Anthropocene. Is really concerning the large scale survival of human race, or survival of the planet, or things like that. So, and the same thing, I think, the type of engagement that Marx had with the world was the angle from which he could theorize something that concerned the entire capitalism, as opposed to a particular movement here and there within a particular region.
Because, I mean, one thing that Badiou has in common with that Frederick Jameson guy. Frederick Jameson says, you cannot make a cognitive mapping of the capitalist totality if you don't have something to oppose to it. So for him, the analytic theory of capitalism and the socialist project, they are two sides of the same coin. If there's nothing going on that points to something else, there's no way that you can see the place you're in as a whole, because there's no other place, right? So for him, the socialist project was a condition. So the early socialism of the 20th century was a condition for you to name capitalism as a totality, because you could stand on something else and say, look at this thing, which is not the whole, right? When you don't have a socialist project anymore, there's no way of naming the whole of capitalism, because there's no other place for you to stand. My impression is that the climate crisis has led to a very desperate attempt to come up with a different place, but that is mostly based on non-subjective assumptions, like not an engaged assumption of we can do something else. Now look from this something else at capitalism, but based on let's say, not ideas, but ghosts. So look at the ghosts of other civilizations. Look at the ghost of the children who will be born. Look at animals with whom you have absolutely no, like you're not going to build anything with the animals, but just look from their perspective. So you want this sort of dehumanized perspectives to function as this other place, but that doesn't engage anyone because you cannot adopt that perspective, right? It is a critique of humanism and human-centered activity and all its destruction, but it's nice from that perspective, but it's totally not political in the sense that you cannot adopt that perspective. Like, and if you want to adopt it, you're actually kind of shamed to death because you shouldn't want to. Like, you need to recognize the rights of some other perspective. So it's not a common perspective, right? So it's kind of a half project in Jameson's sense. Like, it's very much trying to get us to see a totality, but it's so distrustful of a sort of common project that it's not a perspective you can inhabit. You can do art with it, you can do academic anthropology with it, but you cannot you cannot do politics with it in the sense of organize anything differently because of it, right? The moment that you try to do it, it becomes a bit obvious that you are actually just doing what you always did. Like, you're not going to do a new politics because you're taking cows into consideration. You're still going to be humans shifting cows around. You're not making cows into agents that decide something together with you. Like, there's something slightly hypocritical, at least for now, in the sort of very radical metaphysical claims that, you know, non-humanist politics are suggesting. So this sort of approach, I think, that we're talking about, I think it is intervening in the same debate. You need something else in order to be able to look at capitalism as a totality, especially now, because the totality cannot be circumscribed to nation states or to the imperialist core of capitalism. You cannot name the problem by naming America. You cannot name the problem by naming presidents or anything like this, or local capitalists. But whatever it is the position you need to take, that position needs to be subjectivizable, right? Something you can engage, some position you can occupy. So I think that this theoretical space is coherent with that problem. Like, it goes well with that issue, which I think is a very contemporary one. I think the old Russian cosmonauts were not anticipating Elon Musk. So we had a shot before Elon Musk put a car with a fake astronaut around the Earth. But now I think that that's not really, that is clearly also a sort of idealist, desperate attempt. It's not like we're going to build a rocket to escape the planet. So we're not going to be able to use that, you know? And it's also hard to see how some shamanic practices of evoking unborn children is going to also help us reorganize. Like, I find it a very beautiful discourse that the children of the future are political agents, but I've never seen a meeting with them. You know, I think that even like the shamans that people are mentioning, the new witches, they don't really incorporate the spirits of the future. They can only incorporate the spirits of the past. So you have a spiritual logical problem as well. Like, so there's that issue. If we could make them speak, perhaps that would be available, the possibility, but I'm not sure if it is right now. So all of that to say that, again, it all ranges on the little c for now. If you can come up with a way of describing this linearization as a class of ways of doing it, right? Of balance, of accounting for the intelligibility of generative effects. If there's a whole bunch of way of doing it, then there is a way of making, for example, the price system one amongst many. That's a way of reducing it, situating it, right?
Can you tell me if I wanted to go back and listen to the presentation of this thesis, which data should go back? Or you send the link
like the third one, right?
You send the link to YouTube in the chat.
Yeah, I'll do. But if you look there, you will see it's the general discussion was in this one. Sorry.
Sending the whole list.
Yeah,
the
if
third
you could.
one.
Yeah, but it was the first one we did, right? It was this one, 29 of July.
Yeah, 29 is the outline.
Yeah, I thought that's what he asked.
Ah, okay.
I know you're asking about the generative thing, the Adam.
Yeah, that thesis presentation, Eli.
Ah, sorry. Yeah, that was the 17th of August.
The Book of Eli.
Yeah,
the Book of Eli, exactly.
I have to go, but one more thing I wanted to point out is about the finding a place to stand on so you can view the space. I think it's interesting because, and we haven't talked about Karatani today, but that was one of the, I feel like, most interesting points that he made in the structure of world history, which is that the manifestation of mode D in the structure of world history came about through religion, the notion of universal religion. And that was like a way of constructing a space from which you could stand on that could be outside of the mode C, the other modes, right? So
I agree with you.
It relates to that logic of it. Also, it's nice because Karatani is all about localizing capitalism as well, right?
Yeah. I think that was the purpose of this meeting, right? To see if between Karatani and Badiou we can start coming up with a theory where capitalism looks like a world amongst a class of possible worlds, right? Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to the requirement that you pointed out, which is like it has to be subjectivizable in a naive sense too. Like, like religion makes that connection between the local and the global in a way that,
nothing else does.
Yeah, and other things do not. Yeah, so there's that that requirement. You cannot skip past that and go straight to show people like category theory and say, oh, that's everything,
Yeah, I think that there is a nice distinction also because in Karatani gives us three already existing ways that this fourth mode appeared, right? So in mini world systems, like where mode A was the biggest one, it's a kind of immanent substance, right? So religion is kind of pointing to an immanent totality, right? Like everything is connected with everything. Everything is a perspective, right? So it's more immanent, but also it has limits. Then in mode B, you get a transcendent view of everything. So God is like bird's eye view of a society, right? It's not true that everything is a perspective, but the difference between sovereign and citizen, which are, they're not all equal. It's guaranteed by a view from the outside, right? And then in capitalism, you have a sort of in between, right? Capitalism is very big, and you have small communities and half states, right? And religion is something that, and conspiracy theories and all of this allows you to do this, right? It's intersectional, perhaps. So I don't know, there is also a nice thing to talk about in terms of, so universal religions, he posits here, animism and other forms of more natural spirituality, he posits here. Then there's this sort of kind of almost like a support system, or a sort of what Jameson calls cognitive mapping, which is proper to the appearance of religion in mode C, right? And then there's the issue that is open, which is, okay, how does this play out when mode D is the general principle, right? And we were trying to distinguish these two things here, right? We actually brought the idea of the non-principal ultra filter as something that is a formal way to think about this, perhaps. But anyway, just to distinguish those things as well, right?
Perfect. Yeah. Now we've touched on all the meetings. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed. That was a good thing that you brought that one up.
Now we can end on that completion.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think this is useful just to make sure, you know, that when we, for example, when Yasha continues his presentation, that we also, you know, force him to spell out stuff that we can see the connection with the other stuff, you know. For now, for example, it seems to me that between the IIT discussion and the generativities discussion, which we've seen that there are connections, that we should force them out here as well, right? Because I think that for now they're still a bit, what Yasha is presenting is a bit separate from those other two things. Like they seem more clearly connected, perhaps. And also to talk about, you know, how to, I mean, Caron was talking about the presentations that he and Pedro are planning. I'm also trying to think stuff that I could do next. I think it's good to have this overview to think about where everyone can pitch in, you know?
It's great. I mean, I didn't believe that everything had a common thread, but now I believe it again.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, it was very nice today.
Yeah, it was surprising.
Yeah, it was a bit surprising.
Oh, like, what the hell do these things have to do with each other?
It's a mini version of the thing we're talking about, right? If you come up with a common position that you can subjectivize, suddenly a whole mishmash of fragments, they also seem to be under a certain totality. So it's a miniature. Yeah, man. It makes meta sense, not only local sense.
So if in the WhatsApp group you send the YouTube link as well as the link to the Hayek and Eli's, the book of Eli, book of Eli.
Okay.
Okay, guys, I gotta go.
Yeah, me too.
Great meeting.
Thank
Great
you.
meeting, guys.
Bye.
Nice seeing you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.